inevitability. When one person goes missing, it's always a tragedy for their family. But imagine the horror that befalls the loved ones if an entire family disappears. And if there are children involved, the grief is indescribable. Matters concerning the life and health of children are always perceived with a special sensitivity. They are innocent from birth. Unfortunately, there are times when these little angels suffer and bear responsibilities just as adults do. A complicated situation unfolded in the fall of 2013 in Deltona, Florida, USA, involving the family of Yesenia Suarez and Luis Toledo. The 28-year-old mother vanished along with her children, 9-year-old Thalia and 8-year-old Michael Otto. Law enforcement officers began the search and investigation into the disappearance immediately. However, the clues discovered soon left the seasoned officers astonished. What happened overnight from October 22nd to October 23rd is shrouded in mystery and defies all logic. Disappearance. The next morning, Felicita Perez, the mother of the main character, waited for her usual call. Yesenia called her every day between 8:30 and 9 a.m., but this time there was no call. The elderly woman grew concerned, as such behavior was out of character for her daughter. Over the next 2 hours, she tried to make contact, but all attempts were futile. The mobile phone of the person being called was turned off. Felicita then called the school where her grandchildren attended. However, the administration informed her that the children had not arrived for classes. The mother's concern grew. Around 11 a.m., she decided to visit Yesenia's home, but nobody answered the door. After this, the worried woman sought help from the police. The compelling arguments she presented convinced the officers to respond to the message. Upon arriving at Yesenia's residence, police officers began inspecting the house and the surrounding area. Soon after, 35-year-old Luis, the husband of the missing woman, arrived. He seemed surprised to find law enforcement at his home and initially expressed indignation. However, once he learned the reasons for their presence, he softened. During the conversation, the man mentioned that he last saw his wife and children the night before. After a minor argument, she packed some belongings and left, saying nothing to him. The family was on the verge of divorce, so after another quarrel, he spent the night in the car. By morning, the house was empty. Toledo stated that he was deeply saddened that after years together, his wife did not even bother to say goodbye. His words were credible. He also gave permission for a search. Inside the home, except for scattered children's toys, everything was orderly. No signs of forced entry or struggle were detected. It seemed quite possible that the young woman left at the first opportunity along with her children. Also missing were her second car, a 2013 Honda Accord, as well as her personal items, documents, and mobile phone. Nevertheless, there were elements that raised concerns. Firstly, Suarez was very close to her relatives. Therefore, she would not have kept them in the dark and would have informed them of her plans or current whereabouts. Secondly, a peculiar smell lingered in the house, especially strong in the bedroom, bathroom, and the hallway leading from it. At places, the smell of cleaning products mixed with the scent of vinegar. This led detectives to two conclusions. Either the homeowners were exceptionally clean, or someone was attempting to destroy evidence of a crime that had occurred there. Thirdly, Felicita's account raised suspicions. She had previously told the police that on October 22nd, a terrible argument occurred between Yesenia and Luis, during which he showed aggression and struck her daughter. Finally, neighbors of the couple, who had gathered at the arrival of the police, reported strange noises coming from the house under investigation. Witnesses explained that they heard something resembling a scream around 2 a.m., but did not attach any significance to it. Altercations among teenagers in this area were not uncommon. Therefore, only when law enforcement arrived did they realize that something extraordinary had happened. On the brink of collapse, subsequent investigations shed light on the details of the argument mentioned by the mother of the missing woman and her children. Luis suspected his wife of infidelity and had installed a tracking program on her phone. This led him to discover an affair between Yesenia and her colleague, Kevin Dren. On October 22nd, the distraught husband confronted his wife at her workplace, publicly accused her of infidelity, and slapped her. He then declared he would not hinder the lovers further. During the conflict, one of the organization's employees called emergency services to report the incident. However, Toledo left the building before the police arrived. The officers interviewed Suarez, who admitted that she often experienced such uncontrollable behavior from her husband, but had never sought help. Her statements were documented and recorded. After work, Yesenia visited her mother's house, where her children were waiting. They had dinner together, after which Toledo called her. Felicita recounted hearing about their conversation. Luis apologized and pleaded not to press charges against him. He also warned that something unpleasant might happen if she did not comply with his demands. It turns out the protagonist of the story had decided to obtain a restraining order against her husband. But after the call, she changed her mind, explaining to her family that it would only make things worse. Late in the evening, Toledo came to his mother-in-law's house and spoke with the women. He was distraught, complaining that his marriage was falling apart. He expressed his love for his family and his desire not to lose them. Yesenia, however, was determined and declared that a divorce was imminent. After this, he left. To give him time to cool off and come to terms with the new reality, the woman initially decided to stay overnight at her parental home. Nevertheless, after meeting with her husband, she took the children and returned home. Unfortunately, this was the last time the mother saw her daughter and grandchildren. Arrest. Due to the incident at Suarez's office the day before and her subsequent disappearance, the police had solid grounds to arrest Luis. The man was shocked and appeared bewildered. At the station, he reiterated his version of the events that happened overnight. After arguing with his wife at her mother's house, he went to a neighbor's place, where he stayed until 1 a.m. He then decided to spend the night in his car to avoid further conflict. At 7 a.m., he returned home and found that no one was there. Despite this, the suspect remained calm and did not express any concern for the missing individuals. He explained this by his confidence that they would soon return or make contact. He claimed Yesenia was not the kind of person who kept others regularly informed, and the current situation was just a foolish coincidence. A love story. Yesenia and Luis met in 2009 during a street festival. They were immediately attracted to each other and quickly fell in love. However, their relationship was anything but harmonious. Everyone around them was convinced that the two were not suited for each other. Suarez had been through a failed marriage before. At 24, she found herself a single mother of 2 young children. Thus, she was determined to set up their lives in the most favorable way possible. She dreamed of providing them with a good education and a better future. To this end, she re-enrolled in college and took up a full-time job. Yesenia worked for an American canine detection service in Lake Mary, a company known for training dogs to work with military and police forces. Luis, in contrast to his partner, was older and just beginning to sort out his life. He had been convicted multiple times in the past and was a former member of the Latin Kings gang. Thanks to his disposition and well-honed fighting skills, he had once held a leading position within the group. However, after turning state's evidence and betraying his peers, he lost his former influence and respect. Therefore, Toledo left the gang, turned away from his criminal past, and enrolled in college for barber training. He even got baptized and started attending church. Luis emerged as a sociable and caring person who tried to help everyone. After meeting Yesenia, he transformed completely. He became a loving and tender partner to her and a caring stepfather to her children. All the neighbors spoke highly of him. They often saw him spending time with his family and playing with the kids in the yard. The young couple got married on the first day of 2011. Although their relationship was initially happy, over time everything changed. Respect and understanding faded away. Luis began to spend a lot of time on video games and neglected his family duties. It seemed all his attention had shifted to the virtual world. His wife repeatedly expressed her grievances, but the situation would only improve temporarily. Felicita often visited the couple since she lived just a few blocks away. Therefore, she was well aware of everything happening in her daughter's life. Gradually, the number of arguments in the family increased. Toledo genuinely did not understand what was expected of him and why they couldn't live as before. One day, he became so angry that he physically lashed out at his wife. After this, their marriage began to crumble. Eyewitnesses. After Luis was detained, detectives began interviewing relatives and acquaintances of the missing family. They also contacted Yesenia's lover, Kevin. He reported that he had spoken with her late on the evening of October 22nd. He called to check on her, concerned that she might be in trouble after the incident at work. During the conversation, Suarez seemed tense, but she assured him that everything was fine and that it would just take some time to settle down. Sometimes her voice sounded unclear, which made him think that she might have had a drink. Their conversation lasted about 5 minutes. At the end, Yesenia wished him a good night and said goodbye. It was clear that Kevin did not know where she was and was genuinely worried that something irreparable might have happened to her. Later, a call came into the police station from Jackson Titian, a neighbor of the suspect. The young man lived with his mother across the street and had inadvertently witnessed the events unfold. He reported that at 6 a.m., Louise came to him asking for help with a task. He needed to pick up a neighbor on his way back from Lake Mary, but he did not explain why. Meanwhile, Toledo got into Yesenia's car, leading the student to assume that her vehicle needed repair and they were heading to a garage. However, the reality was different from what he had imagined. They drove for about 30 minutes and then stopped in the parking lot of a large supermarket. Luis got out and started cleaning the interior of the car. Jackson noticed how thoroughly he wiped down the cabin, all the doors and windows, using a cleaning agent. Afterwards, he put the car mats, a rag, and gloves into a bag and then disposed of the bundle in a trash container. At that moment, the eyewitness did not understand what was happening and felt mixed emotions. He began to suspect that something serious had occurred the night before. Yet, on the other hand, if Toledo was hiding something, why would he take him along? After leaving Yesenia's vehicle, the men headed back. This time, Louise drove while Tishan was sent to the back seat. The ride back to Delton was silent. Unable to bear the tension, Jackson finally asked what had happened. The neighbor simply replied that he had lost his temper and refused to explain further. The incident occupied the 20-year-old student's mind all morning, but after hearing rumors about the family's disappearance, he pieced together the events and immediately called the police. Later, the young man was questioned in the office and confirmed everything he had said on the phone. He then directed law enforcement officers to the location of the sought-after vehicle and the container where Luis had discarded the items. Armed with Jackson's testimony, detectives summoned Toledo. Everyone hoped to see Yesenia and her children alive, so they hoped the alleged criminal would confess sooner rather than later. Therefore, they informed him of everything the neighbor had reported and asked him to comment on these statements. However, the suspect suggested that the law enforcement officers were bluffing and refused to engage in conversation. Investigation. Detectives knew that solid evidence was needed for substantial accusations, so they didn't rush things and instead headed to the parking lot. The sought-after car was indeed there, but it was empty. However, Yesenia's personal belongings were found inside: her purse, Idaho card, wallet, work pass, and mobile phone. Forensic experts examined the vehicle for DNA, blood, or fingerprints, but were unable to find anything conclusive. The experts stated that this was because the car had been cleaned thoroughly. Later, it was discovered that the garage keys still bore a single fingerprint, which turned out to be the suspect's. In the trash bin that Tishan had pointed out, they found a bag containing cleaning supplies, a rag, and some clothing. Additionally, bloodstains were found on the discarded mats and men's shoes. A wet shower curtain and the same cleaning products were then found in a container near the couple's home. When the house was thoroughly inspected, it was difficult to find any traces. However, experts were able to find a few stains in the bathroom. Blood spatters were found on the cabinet doors and on the floor under the bathtub. DNA analysis determined that they belonged to Thalia and Michael. After this discovery, the lead detective expressed doubt that the missing persons would be found alive. Nevertheless, the search continued. The operation involved relatives and acquaintances of Yesenia, as well as numerous volunteers. They searched everywhere, using dogs and divers, but to no avail. It became obvious that the only person who could give any information was Luis, but he continued to remain silent. Confession. Eventually, during the third interrogation, Toledo cracked and confessed to Yesenia's death. However, he continued to deny that he had harmed the children. He recounted that Jackson Tyshawn had come over to his house in the evening to play video games. Suddenly, his wife and children appeared on the doorstep. She no longer liked his games and was even more upset by the events of the day, so she demanded that they leave. But when Luis refused, Yesenia walked up to him and started shaking him by the shoulders. To make her stop, he punched her in the neck. Unfortunately, he didn't calculate the force and the blow proved fatal. She couldn't breathe. I could see her gasping for breath and I couldn't do anything to help. She ended up dying looking at me. The suspect finished his story. The detective then provocatively asked, "Do you miss your children? Would you trade places with them?" Toledo nodded silently. The investigator then asked him to explain how they died. The suspect's behavior changed, and he stated that they were massacred by a neighbor who was present. After Yesenia's death, Thalia and Michael ran into the room. They saw their mother lying on the floor and began screaming. Luis therefore asked Jackson to take them to another place. However, he soon heard loud noises and followed them into the bathroom. When he looked inside, he saw that they were lying on the floor and the neighbor was holding an axe. Luis burst into tears. The man added that after the incident, he was in shock and lost all self-awareness, and Jackson took advantage of the situation and got rid of the bodies. There was silence in the interrogation room. The last hope of finding the missing alive was gone. All that remained was to find the bodies, but the likelihood of finding them was rapidly diminishing. The detectives doubted the man's sincerity. Nevertheless, his claims had to be verified. So Jackson Tyshawn was questioned again. He was immediately told the neighbor's version of events. The young man stated that after returning home from college, he never went out again. He also noted that he had no reason to end the lives of Yesenia or Michael and Thalia. Moreover, he personally went to the police and reported the incident. Soon his alibi was confirmed. He was cleared of suspicion and released home. The desire to end it all. The search for Yesenia, Michael, and Thalia continued relentlessly. Despite considerable public attention and the large number of people involved, the efforts were unsuccessful. Every neighborhood was combed, including woods, bodies of water, and local landfills, all to no avail. Detectives feared that without the bodies, there might not be enough evidence to convict. However, something unexpected soon happened. During one of the routine interrogations, Toledo asked to use the restroom. Accompanied by several officers, since the restroom was at the other end of the building, they had to walk a short distance. During this walk, the detainee asked for a favor. He wanted to be taken home so that he could end his life. Understandably, he was not released. Instead, Luis asked the officers to remove his handcuffs so they could shoot him as if he were trying to escape. This bizarre request was also ignored. In response, one of the officers asked where his family's bodies were. Toledo muttered that he would never reveal that information. When the detainee entered the restroom, he managed to close the door behind him. Soon, there was the sound of breaking glass. It turned out that the suspect had broken the mirror over the sink and used the shards to slash his wrists. He was clearly determined to end his life and was doing everything he could to do so. But it was unclear what was driving him. Was it guilt and remorse for what had happened, or fear of the punishment awaiting him? Later, he did give an explanation for his actions. The policeman broke down the door and pulled out the bloody man, whose devious plan had failed. He received timely medical attention, and his life was not threatened. However, the detainee's behavior revealed much. It turned out that he feared retaliation from his former colleagues, who traditionally had an unkind attitude toward those who harmed children, unlike their attitude toward unfaithful spouses. Luis realized that if he ended up in prison, he was in for a rough ride. his past convictions when he turned in the Latin Kings leaders, and the new murder charges would weigh heavily against him. This was confirmed by the contents of his letters sent during the investigation. In one of them, he expressed his desire to tell the whole truth, but could not, as it would be used against him. He reminded everyone that Yesenia had been unfaithful to him, and added that he would never harm the children in any way. "I love them more than anything and continue to love them to this day," he wrote. On October 28, Luis was charged with Yesenia's murder, and the following January, with the murders of Michael and Thalia. The prosecution did not rule out that a third person was involved in the crime and helped the accused dispose of the bodies. Given his past criminal experience, Toledo also knew how to clean up a crime scene professionally on his own. Justice has been served. The trial of the man took place in 2017. The prosecutor argued that the accused committed the crime out of jealousy. However, he did not confess to ending the lives of Thalia and Michael, since there was no justification for such actions. Therefore, Luis came up with an absurd story involving a neighbor. Kimberly Lasanta, Toledo's sister-in-law, testified in favor of the prosecution. She told the court that because of numerous threats from him, she obtained a restraining order against him. She claimed that Luis had previously sent her text messages threatening to take the children and send someone to harm her. At trial, she testified to her constant fear of him and produced the saved text messages. The defense, on the other hand, attempted to incriminate Jackson Tycon, resulting in a lie detector test and searches of his home and car, though nothing incriminating was found. That day, Jackson was indeed troubled by Luis's erratic behavior. Luis looked tense and scared, but Jackson didn't bother to get to the bottom of it because he couldn't imagine the horrible events that had transpired. Felicita and the children's biological father attended the trial. Relatives of the victims seemed overwhelmed with grief and were almost ready to confront Toledo in the courtroom. After 7 hours of deliberation, the jury found the defendant guilty of second-degree murder in the case of Yesenia and first-degree murder in the case of Thalia and Michael. Luis was sentenced to 3 life terms without the possibility of parole. Interestingly, he initially asked for the death penalty, explaining that death row inmates do not face other inmates, and therefore he would not face retaliation from former gang members with whom he was once associated. The defendant knew that there was a bounty on his head and that he would suffer for the rest of his life. Everyone but the defense was convinced that Toledo had no remorse for his actions, but was simply afraid of what awaited him after the trial. The relatives of the victims were satisfied with the verdict. Outcomes. It is known that Yesenia and her children were active members of the Spanish-speaking Seventh-day Adventist church community in Deltona. The mother was studying at Rollins College in Winter Park, Florida. In spring 2014, she was expected to graduate with honors with a bachelor's degree in human resources management. After her disappearance, the college posthumously awarded her the degree. As of April 2024, the convicted Toledo continues to serve his sentence. He claims that he did not interrupt Thalia and Michael's lives and does not know the whereabouts of their bodies. In one of the letters written from prison, he appears to have coded the message, writing that he sent 3 boxes, 1 large and 2 small ones. The large package reached its destination and the 2 small ones were fine. He added that he cared about what happens to him next, but he was innocent of the charges against him. Perhaps in this way, he wanted to let his acquaintances know that his conscience was clear and he should not be punished. Nevertheless, the evidence was against him. Even the fact that he had previously served 4 years for burglary, robbery, and kidnapping spoke volumes. It is possible that he did lose control of himself and committed inexplicable acts. Experience shows that those who embark on a criminal path rarely get off it. Ohio is located within 2 geographic regions of the United States. Ohio is characterized by a humid continental climate with hot summers and cool winters. Precipitation falls fairly evenly throughout the year, and heavy snowstorms are common in winter. Winter 2018 also saw snowfall and cold weather. On January 28, 2018 at 8 p.m., a car was parked outside an apartment complex. A young, blonde-haired girl got out of the car and walked briskly toward the house. She was returning from work. In her hands, she had a bag of food from her favorite fast food restaurant and the keys to the apartment. As she approached the door, she was surprised to find that the key did not go into the lock. The girl hurriedly decided to check each key on her metal ring, but none of them fit the lock. Suddenly, she remembered that she had given her key to her brother and reopened her purse in search of a spare key. When the key was found and the lock was finally opened, an unfamiliar voice called her name, and she turned around. A large male figure grabbed her and carried her into the apartment with nonchalant assertiveness. The door slammed shut. On January 29, 2018, the staff of Shaw Davis Funeral Home was alarmed by the absence of everyone's favorite assistant Rachel at work. She did not answer the phone, which worried them because the girl was very responsible and took her work seriously. The head of the office asked a colleague, who was engaged in delivery, to come to Rachel's apartment to check on her and find out the reason for the silent absence. He went to the girl's apartment, but no one answered his knock or call. He contacted the manager of the apartment complex, but this attempt was unsuccessful, as it was only possible to enter the apartment with the tenant's permission. Her colleague called the police to the place of residence of the missing girl. When they went inside, they found nothing scary. The apartment looked completely normal, except for the leftover food on the table. Rachel, who adored order, couldn't leave food without putting it away in the refrigerator. This caught the attention of her coworker. He insisted on a more thorough inspection of the apartment in the presence of police officers. During the inspection of the bedroom, he tried to look in the closet, but when he wanted to open the door, he thought something was wrong. With effort, he yanked the closet door open and screamed. Hidden inside was Rachel's bloody body. Officer Frank Sclafani called forensics, and the apartment complex area was cordoned off. In her own apartment, Rachel Anderson's bound body was discovered in a bedroom closet. She was stripped to the waist, partially wrapped in a blanket. Her head was wrapped in a shirt, and the black article of clothing was tied around her neck with part of the fabric stuffed into her mouth as a gag. The victim was a young 24-year-old female, Rachel Anderson. Rachel Nicoletta Anderson was born on January 28, 1994, to William Bill Anderson and Patricia Trish Anderson in Warren, Ohio. Rachel had a younger brother, John, who was a common family favorite. She was a 2012 graduate of Warren Harding High School, where she was part of the National Honor Society and played soccer and volleyball. Rachel chose a completely unusual profession. Since childhood, she dreamed of becoming a funeral director. The girl studied at Youngstown State University, where she specialized in the study of the bodies of the dead. She treated her vocation with great importance, for which she got into the list of the best students and received a scholarship. She then attended Cincinnati College of Mortuary Science, where she graduated in 2016 with a Bachelor of Science in Mortuary Science. After becoming a member of the Ohio Funeral Directors Association, Rachel moved to Columbus, where she began her internship at Shaw Davis Funeral Home. She was very reverent about her work and felt it was her duty to support and assist the relatives of the deceased. Her internship was coming to an end, and Rachel dreamed of becoming a full-fledged employee of the Bureau, but her dreams of the future were destroyed and sneakily taken away in the most brutal way. Rachel's body was taken to the morgue, and investigators interviewed the first witnesses. The autopsy performed on Rachel Anderson's body revealed the mystery of the horrific manipulations she had endured that night. The young woman had been strangled and stabbed. She suffered a laceration to her scalp and fractures to the base of her skull. The stab wound went through the back of her neck and penetrated the left hemisphere of her brain. Rachel was stabbed with such force that part of her skull broke off. The autopsy also revealed that she had been strangled with an electric blanket cord, and as a result of the strangulation, she had hemorrhaged in her sternoclavicular muscles and eyelids, and the blood vessels in her eyes had filled with blood. In addition, forensic evidence showed that bruises and red marks on her ankles and wrists indicated that she was alive when the perpetrator tied her up. A DNA sample was found on the rope and on Rachel's body. The coroner who performed an autopsy on Rachel Anderson found that the death was caused by a stab wound to the head and neck, although the initial theory was strangulation. After interviewing several employees from Rachel's work, as well as her ex-boyfriend who had an alibi, police continued to look at different versions of the attack. Detectives returned to the victim's apartment to conduct searches in hopes of finding evidence or traces of the perpetrator that could unravel the case. On the living room floor, they found Rachel's purse, which was missing her wallet. The 9-inch steak knife used to stab Anderson was found by her mother 2 weeks after the crime in a box in her apartment. So detectives had their first theory, robbery. But such a brutal torture of the girl said that the perpetrator was not just a robber, but a skilled maniac who took pleasure in the display of his power over the victim. Investigators considered different motives, and for some time had no suspects, and the manner of the girl's death was not disclosed, maintaining the secrecy of the investigation. After some time, the investigation received DNA samples that were found on several parts of Rachel's body and at the crime scene itself. But, unfortunately, the obtained samples were not recognized by the database of special services. The obtained video from street surveillance cameras showed 2 people who used her car to drive around the city after Rachel's death. At that time, cash was withdrawn from the dead girl's debit and credit cards. Data obtained by the location service identified a phone number that was in Rachel Anderson's apartment from 7:59 p.m. to 9:25 p.m. on January 28, 2018. By examining the evidence, it became clear where the caller was at different times. Having identified the account from the phone number found, investigators were able to identify the suspect. He turned out to be 54-year-old Anthony Pardon, a recidivist, violent criminal and rapist, whose criminal history before the murder of Rachel Anderson included several rapes, as well as robbery, kidnapping, and attempted murder. He spent a total of 33 years in prison for his crimes. The maniac had a hard fate. He was raised by his grandparents before he started living with his mother. As a child, the boy was diagnosed with conduct disorder and antisocial personality disorder due to social problems. In March 1979, Anthony, 14, was temporarily committed to the Ohio Youth Commission. In July of that year, he was placed in the custody of the court and temporarily transferred to Franklin County Children's Services. And as late as December, he was again found guilty of making threats and was transferred to the Ohio Youth Commission and placed in foster care. In 1980, Pardon was charged with abuse. The victim was the foster parent's son. Pardon, who was 15 years old when he committed the crime, was babysitting while his foster mother went grocery shopping. He told Columbus police he committed the crime because he was upset after an argument with his girlfriend. Anthony was convicted of the crime as a juvenile. On November 13, 1981, 16-year-old Pardon was allowed to enter the home of his girlfriend's 39-year-old mother to use the telephone. He pulled a butcher knife on her, took advantage of her, and stole $100 from her purse. He then bound her hands and feet, gagged her, and put her in the trunk of his car. He drove her to Valleydale, where he untied her feet and threw her into the river behind the Valleydale ballroom. When the perpetrator saw that the victim, who was partially clothed, was able to stay afloat, he waded into the creek and submerged her head underwater. The woman survived after the intervention of a random passerby who scared Anthony away. The boy then managed to get away before the police arrived and used the money he stole from the victim to buy tennis shoes and jogging uniforms. In May 1982, at age 17, he was convicted of other crimes in Franklin. He was sentenced to a term of imprisonment ranging from 5 to 25 years. While in prison, he committed several disciplinary offenses, including possession of a weapon, burning a mattress, and fighting. He eventually spent over 24 years in prison for his crimes and was released in November 2006. Upon gaining his freedom, Anthony Pardon moved to Georgia and applied for a job under an assumed name. But in 2007, he was charged with forgery and was again convicted in Floyd County, where he spent 9 years in prison. He was also given 20 years probation and was required to wear a GPS tracker on his ankle. In 2017, Pardon was released from prison, returning to Ohio in June of that year under an interstate agreement between Ohio and Georgia. He was monitored by the Adult Parole Authority and was required to check in with the Sheriff's Department every 90 days. The Ohio Adult Parole Authority did not provide him with a monitor, as requested by the judge, because of the length of supervision and cost concerns. Due to budget savings and careless negligence of state authorities, a former maniac and criminal was walking free again. So, on August 21, 2017, Pardon was caught with a girl of easy virtue in his car, and 6 days later he was caught driving without a license. During that stop, he was found to be in possession of a kitchen knife and a shotgun. But again, either by some strange coincidence or police negligence, he was not arrested. The perpetrator's escapades continued. One of the CCTV footage shows Rachel's car stopped outside a store. A man got out of the car on the passenger side and headed into the store to store. The driver was not visible on the footage, which added some complications. But after visiting that store and interviewing the employees, the police managed to find out the man's identity. He turned out to be a local vagrant, Anthony Schlitz. A couple of days later, he was questioned at the station. He said that he was approached by a passing mature man and offered to cash in the cards of his ex-girlfriend. He agreed and thus became a co-conspirator in the Rachel Anderson case. Anthony Schlitz confirmed the identity of Anthony Pardon and outlined the entire route they took on the evening of January 28, 2018, in an attempt to cash out Rachel's stolen cards. The matter remained to be resolved. Find and apprehend Anthony Pardon. On February 9, 2018, a multi-day stakeout of Anthony Pardon's sister's house resulted in his apprehension. The 54-year-old repeat offender was charged with 9 counts, including aggravated burglary, aggravated robbery, kidnapping, rape, and aggravated murder. On February 4, 2020, the protracted trial began. 4 witnesses testified on the first day, including Rachel's co-worker Jonathan Kennedy, who discovered Anderson's body. Jonathan and the manager of her apartment complex also testified. The jury heard from Officer Frank Sclafani, who was in his car outside the apartment when Kennedy discovered the girl's body and saw the surveillance tape. Rachel's brother John and Special Agent Joshua Durst testified on February 5th, and lead detective Art Hughes testified on February 6th. On February 6th, the inmate complained to the judge about his attorneys, saying he was not satisfied at all and asked for new attorneys. Recidivist Anthony Pardon was intentionally stalling. On Monday, February 10th, prosecutors brought in a latent print expert and other expert witnesses to explain how technology was used to identify where Rachel Anderson's debit card was used and at the crime scene. The defendant's sister also testified that he gave her Rachel's debit card, telling her that it was his girlfriend's card. Later, from television news reports, she learned that the card belonged to the crime victim. The last day of testimony was Tuesday, February 11th. The medical examiner testified that Pardon's DNA was found at the scene, while a forensic pathologist and a deputy coroner from the Franklin County office testified about Rachel Anderson's injuries. In the courtroom, a minute-by-minute picture of the last days of Rachel Anderson's life was reconstructed. On January 26 and 27, 2018, Rachel celebrated her 24th birthday. On the 26th, her brother John traveled from Warren to Columbus to visit her. The next day, she traveled with her brother to the home of her friend and colleague John Kennedy. There, the friends threw a party to celebrate Rachel's birthday. After a long party, Rachel and her brother spent the night at the house of friends, and the next day the girl went from them to work, leaving the key to her apartment to her brother. On the 28th, John Anderson returned to his hometown and accidentally brought the key with him. At about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Rachel texted John Kennedy, who had a key to her house. She said she would come to his place and pick up the key. Rachel spoke to her mother around 6:30 p.m. and then went and got her key from Kennedy. Since her apartment door could only be locked from the outside with a key, Anderson had to leave it unlocked. She stopped for dinner at her favorite restaurant and pulled up in front of the house at about 7:30 p.m. She then left the apartment. Hargan was waiting for her outside the apartment. He abducted Rachel by taking her from the bottom floor to the top floor. He held her down with savage force while he bound her feet and ankles with a hairdryer cord, then tied her hands with a belt and blinds cords. When the victim was immobilized, he wrapped a curling iron cord between her wrists. To stop her from screaming, he gagged her. The villain forced Rachel Anderson to give him the PIN numbers to her cards. He tortured her and took advantage of her. He then strangled the girl in cold blood with a cord from an electric blanket. In addition to strangulation, the perpetrator also inflicted blunt force trauma and a stab wound to her head. He then carefully hid her body in a closet. He left her there naked below the waist, and with the electric blanket cord tied around her neck and door handle. The perpetrator then stole her car, used all of her bank cards at several stores in Columbus for a quick profit. The defense did not call any witnesses. The final hearing was held on February 12th. Assistant prosecutor Amy Van Keulen made the state's initial closing argument, constructing a chronology of the crime and telling the jury that Pardon massacred Rachel Anderson in cold blood. In defense closing argument, defendant's attorney Larry Thomas acknowledged that Pardon used the victim's cards, but argued that he was not responsible for the crime. The attorney argued that the state's case was based on speculation, and the DNA and cell phone evidence did not prove Pardon's involvement in the crime. The jury, made up of 4 men and 8 women, deliberated for about 6 hours over 2 days before finding him guilty on all counts. The prosecution sought the death penalty because he killed Rachel Anderson in an aggravated burglary because he had a prior conviction for a similar attempted murder of a woman. Prosecutors sought the death penalty instead of clemency because of his extensive criminal history. Prosecutor O'Brien said there are some people who basically cannot behave in accordance with the law, and Anthony Pardon is one of them. The sentencing phase of the trial began on February 18th. A defense seeking to mitigate aggravating factors cited the suspect's troubled childhood to the court and jury. But that didn't work, and prosecutors voiced that the aggravating circumstances outweighed any mitigating factors. And furthermore, it was proven at trial that Anthony Pardon was fully aware of what he was doing when he attacked Rachel. Pardon's mother and sister, along with a psychologist and his former elementary school teacher, did testify in his defense. On February 19th, Anthony Pardon self-reported a 13-minute unscripted statement to the jury, discussing his abusive childhood. He also spoke about his problems after leaving prison, describing hardship and helplessness. He claimed that the system failed him and no one helped him. In his last statement, he blamed the justice system for who he is today. He did not speak directly about the crime or apologize for it during his statement. On February 20th, after 3.5 hours of deliberation, the jury deadlocked on whether to recommend the death penalty and recommended life in prison without parole. Sentencing took place on March 16, 2020. Rachel Anderson's mother, Rachel Anderson, cried in court as the verdict was announced. The father issued a statement, recounting his observations of the investigation over the past few years. He was extremely surprised at how a violent criminal and repeat offender made demands and became hysterical as if he was owed money. The man was shocked as a grown man, complaining that the system had failed him, trying in every way possible to absolve himself of even the slightest bit of guilt. In his final statement, the father of the deceased noted that there is obviously blame to be placed on the system, but in the situation that happened, it only failed Rachel Anderson. Judge McIntosh sentenced Anthony Pardon to 1 life sentence without parole for aggravated murder and another life sentence without parole for violence. Anthony Pardon was also sentenced to an additional 63 years in prison for aggravated burglary, kidnapping, and aggravated robbery, and multiple violent offenses. The sentences must be served consecutively. An evil fate. It was the 24th birthday for Rachel Anderson. The life of a young woman who had everything ahead of her was cut short. Her internship was coming to an end, and she was about to be offered a promising job. Rachel was buried at Pineview Memorial Park. Her family and friends are having a difficult time recovering from such a sudden loss. Each year on January 28th, her loved ones light a candle in their homes and remember the blonde-haired, smiling Rachel. After all, to know Rachel meant to love Rachel. She was just a beautiful soul, and she would do anything for any of her friends. Rachel had many hobbies throughout her life. First and foremost was her career. She had the gift of compassion. She loved dancing and socializing with family and friends. She loved children. She loved her life that was stolen from her. When a person falls in love, they often become weaker, more vulnerable, and prone to idealizing the object of their affection. In such a state, it's difficult to critically assess the qualities of the beloved. Any negativity from their side is quickly justified, and clear problems or odd behaviors are simply ignored. Overwhelmed by feelings, we tend to overlook the shortcomings of our beloved. But if those feelings are not mutual, and the loved one is capable of deceit or criminal acts, the lover can find themselves in serious danger. Several years ago, the story of a young man named Diogo Gonalves shook all of Portugal due to its cruelty and cold-bloodedness, with two young, fragile-looking girls with angelic appearances as the ruthless perpetrators. The deceased youth and his executioners were participants in a love triangle, but do not be too quick to blame Diogo. He was not romantically involved with the two girls, but became the victim of the schemes and greed of his charming colleague, whom he loved unrequitedly, and her lover. Now, let's carefully examine this complex case from the beginning to understand how quiet and modest beauties turned into cruel criminals, robbers, and carjackers, why the victim's body was found in pieces in various places, and how a serious and prudent young man failed to realize he was lured into a deadly trap. The story of Diogo Gonalves. Diogo Gonalves was born on July 17, 1999, in the picturesque resort town of Albufeira, located in the south of Portugal. He was the only child of a simple and relatively modest family. His parents ran a small souvenir shop, so their well-being depended directly on the season and the number of tourists visiting the town. Diogo grew up modest, polite, and friendly. He did well in school, was interested in computers from a young age, and dreamed of a career in programming. People spoke of him as an open, sociable young man with many friends, both in and outside of school. He disliked being alone, hence he always sought the company of family or friends. After finishing school, the young man enrolled in a computer academy, but since the education was quite expensive, he also took a part-time job at a fast food restaurant to help his parents and partially pay for his education. Diogo had already established himself as a hardworking and very reliable employee who could be counted on in every way. In early 2017, tragedy struck the Gonalves family. The family head suffered a severe stroke, which left him balancing on the brink of life and death for several weeks. When his condition stabilized, the man remained incapacitated for a long time and was under constant medical supervision. But misfortune does not come alone, and while the father fought for his life, his wife was struck by a car on her way to the hospital. The incident happened suddenly at a pedestrian crossing. As the woman reached the middle of the road, a car appeared out of nowhere at high speed, literally throwing her into the air, and without even braking, sped away. The impact was so forceful that the victim was thrown a dozen meters, sustained an open head injury, and had no chance of survival. Medics arrived within minutes, but they could only declare her death. The driver responsible for the fatal accident was detained the next day, but despite the clear evidence of his guilt, a long and complicated legal battle ensued, as the man had hired a competent lawyer. The unfortunate Diogo, not yet 18, was left completely alone. At that moment, his aunt, the sister of his father, arrived in Albufeira and offered to become the guardian of the teenager and to care for her bedridden brother. However, the relationship between the aunt and her nephew was far from perfect. The authoritative woman dictated her rules, which the young man greatly disliked. and as soon as he reached adulthood, he immediately moved to a rented apartment. Unrequited love. In 2018, a young software specialist was interning at one of the largest tourist spas in the region. His skills and abilities were highly regarded by the management, and he was offered a permanent position with a stable income. Additionally, the sociable, open, and friendly young man quickly integrated into the team and formed friendships with his colleagues. Diogo conscientiously performed his duties and was always ready to help others. At this spa center worked an attractive young woman named Maria Malvero, towards whom the new IT specialist developed tender feelings. He began to court her cautiously, but for the most part, the colleague ignored his advances. Nevertheless, she communicated with him willingly, accepted gifts, but responded to all date invitations with refusals or quickly changed the subject. Diogo unknowingly fell deeply in love with this petite, dark-haired beauty, who held a rather untraditional position as a security service employee. Maria combined strength and femininity. She was approachable yet unattainable, and the young man couldn't resist her. This was his first true love, which proved to be fateful for him. Maria, the complicated Maria Malvero, a year older than Diogo, was also a native of Albufeira and came from a very modest family. She never knew her biological father, as he left when she was very young and subsequently showed no interest in her fate or provided financial support. Maria was raised by her mother and grandmother, but her grandmother passed away a few years ago, and her mother was diagnosed with a severe mental disorder and placed in a specialized clinic. From a young age, Maria understood that she could only rely on herself, and thus she strived to make her way in life. She was seriously involved in sports from school, strong and physically developed, while maintaining a delicate and graceful appearance. In high school, she took up jiu-jitsu and even earned a blue belt. Malvero dreamed of a career in law enforcement, but due to her mother's mental condition, she was denied admission to the police academy, which greatly upset her. Instead, she underwent special training, becoming a professional security officer, and was accepted into the security department of the spa center. Maria's salary barely covered the essentials, as she had to pay for the treatment and care of her ailing mother, whose condition was deteriorating. Nonetheless, the young woman did not despair. She remained optimistic about the future and was kind and friendly with those around her. However, the infatuated Diogo misinterpreted her politeness as reciprocal interest. He even turned down a promising job offer in the capital because he hoped to win Maria's love and did not want to be away from her. The young man spent a third of his salary on his beloved, buying her gifts and taking her to restaurants and amusement parks. They soon appeared to be a happy couple, yet throughout their time together, Maria never once allowed him a kiss. However, as it turned out, her reserve was not due to excessive modesty or shyness. One day, Diogo stumbled upon a short video on social media where his beloved was hugging and kissing another girl. It turned out she had been in a romantic relationship with 23-year-old Mariana Fanesco for over a year. Devastated, Diogo confronted Maria, asking why she had not been upfront with him, but she replied that she preferred to keep her personal life private. Despite such a revelation, Gonsalves continued his courtship, never giving up hope that one day she might reciprocate his love. The greed for easy gain Mariana Fanesco also came from a humble background and received no financial support from her family. She graduated from a nursing college and worked as a basic nurse at a local hospital. She and Maria dreamed of renting a place together to live, but their modest incomes and the need to support their families made this impossible. In January 2020, when Diogo once again invited Maria to dinner at a restaurant, he mentioned that the court case against the driver who fatally struck his mother had just concluded. The driver was found guilty and ordered to pay a substantial compensation of 100,000 euros, which had been transferred to Diogo's account that very day. Diogo spoke about it dispassionately, even with sadness, as no amount of money could bring back his closest person and he didn't notice Maria's eyes light up when she heard the news. From that moment, their relationship unexpectedly progressed to a new level for Diogo. Maria began showing interest in him and even tenderly held his hand during walks, something she had never done before. Gonçalves couldn't believe his luck, feeling as though his deepest dream was coming true, but he did not ponder why this was happening or what caused such sudden and drastic changes in Maria's behavior. He simply enjoyed the moments, believing Maria's feelings for him were genuine. In reality, as soon as Malvero learned about the money Diogo had received, she shared the news with Finesco, and together they started planning how to seize these funds. Initially, they needed to make Diogo believe that Maria had finally noticed him as a man and reciprocated his affection. Then, the women planned to use either deceit or force to take the money from the young man and escape to another country, where they could start a new life with the stolen funds. A romantic evening turns into a brutal encounter. One day, Maria approached Diogo unexpectedly and suggested spending a romantic evening together. She mentioned that perhaps their relationship could reach a new level, that they could become a couple, and that something might develop between them. At that moment, Diogo was truly happy, and the sudden changes in the girl's behavior did not alarm him. He believed in the sincerity of her feelings. The long-awaited meeting was set for the evening of Friday, March 20th, 2020, at Diogo's rented apartment. The young man himself prepared dinner, set a table for two, bought flowers and a small gift for his beloved. Maria arrived around 8 o'clock in the evening. They sat down at the table, and she poured a fruit fresh that she had brought, urging Diogo to drink all of its contents to appreciate the taste of the beverage she had prepared. Without hesitation, he did so, unaware that the juice contained a high dose of a potent sedative that Mariana had obtained from her workplace. Soon, Diogo felt unwell. His head was spinning. Everything before his eyes blurred, and he felt sleepy. He realized something was wrong and became very nervous, trying to reach his phone, but Maria snatched the device from his hands, saying she wanted to perform an erotic dance for him. She turned on the music, began to slowly undress, and the young man seemed to calm down a bit. Then she tied him to a chair, presenting it as part of the game. At some point, Diogo panicked, tried to free himself, but fell to the floor along with the chair. Seeing Maria simply watching the events unfold, he began to scream and call for help, hoping that the neighbors could hear him. Then, she pressed on his neck, after which the young man lost consciousness. After this, she called Mariana, who had been waiting in a car parked nearby, ready for a signal. When Finesco entered the apartment, she saw Diogo lying on the floor and asked what had happened. Maria explained that the dosage of the drug had apparently been too small, and Diogo had not fallen asleep but started to panic and scream. The girls noticed that he was not breathing and decided to untie him, and Mariana, using her skills, began CPR. When Diogo regained consciousness, he again began to scream, tried to resist and ran out of the apartment. But Maria, using her martial arts skills, knocked him down and performed a chokehold. A few minutes later, Gonçalves showed no signs of life, and the friends did not attempt to revive him further. The imperfect crime. Using fingerprints and Face ID, the girls managed to unlock the deceased young man's phone and access his banking app. They transferred all his available funds to Maria's account, and then pondered how to dispose of the body to delay its discovery as long as possible. Knowing that Gonçalves was expected at work the next day, Malvero decided to send a message from his phone to his boss, requesting time off due to sudden family issues. This message surprised his boss, as during his tenure, the programmer had never asked for time off, been late, or swapped shifts. The boss tried to call the employee to find out what was happening, but all calls were rejected, followed by a message from Diogo claiming he couldn't talk right now. On Saturday, still contemplating what to do with the body, the culprits went to a large shopping mall where they spent some of the money they had stolen from the victim. Surveillance camera footage showed them behaving casually, making purchases, eating at the food court, and smiling as they chatted. They did not appear tense and clearly believed they could evade accountability. Returning to the apartment, the friends decided to sever Diogo's thumb so they could unlock his phone if needed to send messages on his behalf. It was at that moment they realized the best course would be to dismember the body and scatter it in various places, staging the young man's disappearance as if he had taken his own life. They bought plastic wrap and large trash bags, and using a kitchen cleaver and knives, separated the limbs and head from the torso. Mariana's knowledge of human anatomy proved quite useful during this gruesome task. The friends then packed all the parts into 4 bags, which they carried out of the apartment late at night and loaded into the trunk of Diogo's car. Maria drove the car of her deceased admirer, followed by her accomplice in her own vehicle. They drove out of town to a cliff where they dropped the bag containing the torso off the edge, leaving the car near the cliff to make it look as though the young man had jumped. However, they failed to notice that the body did not sink, but got stuck in a crevice at the base of the cliff. They then drove a few miles to a wooded slope where they threw out the head and discarded the victim's limbs over a small waterfall. Body parts on the coast. That Saturday, the management of the spa center reported the employee's disappearance to the police, mentioning the strange messages sent from his number. However, the search for the young man did not start until Sunday, a full day after the disappearance was reported. The first discovery was his car at the cliff's edge, and initially, it was presumed he had taken his own life. But just a few hours later, authorities found a torso in a bag in the crevice below, which was soon confirmed to be Gonsalves through forensic analysis. The same day, a group of tourists reported to the police that they had found a torn bag containing a human head. The limbs were only found several days later, after extensive searches involving divers. The crime scene was horrific, but according to colleagues and friends of the deceased, he had no enemies, was kind-hearted, never broke the law, and did not associate with people who had criminal records or were linked to criminal activities. But who then could have brutally taken the life of such a quiet and friendly young man? The investigation, arrest, and initial court decision. From the early stages of the investigation, it was discovered that the young man had recently received a significant amount of money in his account as compensation from a court decision. However, it was found that mysteriously, this money had been transferred to Diogo's colleague, Maria. She was interrogated as she and Mariana were about to leave the country through the airport. Malvero was caught off guard. She did not expect the police to track them down within just a few days. She confessed immediately, claiming that she committed the crime because her colleague had pursued her and tried to coerce her into intimacy. She also asserted that she had planned and executed the crime on her own, insisting her partner had no involvement. Nonetheless, both women were detained and taken to the station to give their statements. Maria insisted that she had accidentally strangled the young man after he tried to force her into intimacy. However, Diogo's colleagues maintained that he would never treat a woman he liked in such a manner, a sentiment supported by the correspondence between the victim and the accused. Additionally, a high concentration of a potent sedative found in the victim's blood suggested that he was incapacitated at the time of his death. Maria then tried to take full responsibility again, claiming she had committed the crime for the money. She alleged that Mariana was unaware, and when the incident occurred, she even tried to perform CPR on the young man. Mariana, however, contended that they had planned the theft together, intending only to transfer the money to their account and then flee, but that things did not go as planned. There was no doubt about the guilt of the women, but determining their exact roles in the crime proved challenging. Both pleaded to be placed in the same jail during the investigation so they could at least see each other, but despite their requests, they were placed in separate detention facilities, denying them any communication or contact. The trial began in July 2020. Despite Malvero's persistent claims of sole responsibility, investigators doubted she acted alone, questioning how she could skillfully dismember a body without anatomical knowledge. A 6-month period was allotted for the investigation to gather all relevant circumstances, evidence, and testimony. Throughout this time, the suspects had no contact with each other, and the case took an unexpected turn. At a hearing in February 2021, when Maria again claimed full responsibility, Mariana simply confirmed her statements, declaring she had no involvement in the murder or robbery. Maria's lover's behavior seemingly dismayed her, and a month later, Malvero changed her initial testimony. She now claimed that she acted under Mariana's direction, who was the crime's mastermind, and noted that it was her friend who dismembered the body because she knew how to do it best. Maria added that she had initially taken the blame to protect her loved one, but realized that her friend had never truly loved her. Despite Malvero's altered testimony in April 2021, the court found her guilty of premeditated murder, mutilation of a body, robbery, and carjacking. She was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Mariana, as an accomplice, received a 4-year sentence, but was released on parole in less than a year. The court believed her attempts to perform CPR indicated that she had not intended to take his life and wanted to help. A new trial and an unexpected twist. After being released, Mariana Finesco agreed to give an interview to a local TV channel, a decision that proved to be a grave mistake. During the interview, she placed all the blame on her already incarcerated friend, all the while smiling and appearing very self-satisfied. Shortly after the video became public, a well-known psychologist analyzed it, explaining how gestures, facial expressions, and body language can indicate deception. He suggested that Mariana was reveling in her impunity and sense of superiority, indicating she was a seed manipulator capable of shifting all blame onto someone else. A month after her release, Finesco sued the hospital where she had previously worked, claiming she had been wrongfully terminated and demanded a significant amount as moral compensation. Surprisingly, the court sided with her, ordering the hospital management to reinstate her and pay the compensation she sought. It seemed that everything was going exceptionally well for Mariana. She was free, back at her job, and had received 40,000 euros in moral compensation. However, news soon came from the prison that Maria had taken her own life by hanging herself with a bedsheet in her cell. She left behind a note detailing aspects of Diogo's perpetration that implicated her friend. Following this incident, the case was reopened, and the victim's father filed an appeal, insisting that Finesco was as guilty as her accomplice. The Supreme Court only delivered the final verdict in June 2023, finding Mariana guilty of planning and carrying out the murder of Gonalves, as well as dismembering his body and carjacking. Ultimately, she was sentenced to 25 years in prison without the possibility of early release. Since then, she and her lawyer have attempted to file appeals twice, but so far all their appeals have been rejected. The Lissy family tragedy. What drove a devoted family man to the brink? How can one identify a psychopath? Let's delve into what this term encompasses. Psychopathy is a personality disorder marked by distinctive traits such as a lack of empathy and compassion, emotional shallowness, egocentrism, and a deceitful charm. While not an exhaustive list, these qualities are commonly observed in psychopaths. Such individuals are adept at adapting, skillfully manipulating those around them, and expertly concealing their true nature, often to the extent that even those closest to them may not recognize the potential danger. The Lissy family's story serves as a chilling reminder that someone perceived as a loving and close family member can suddenly morph into a remorseless perpetrator, sparing not even their own children. The man's behavior and his stated motives for committing such a heinous act were so alarming and shocking that they raised questions about his sanity. Yet, to everyone's astonishment, a psychiatric evaluation revealed that he was fully aware of his actions and had premeditated the horrific crime. This case shook Italy to its core, particularly the serene province of Mavisanti, where this tragedy unfolded, marking it as the most notorious crime in the small Milanese suburb's history. Now let's methodically unravel this story and attempt to trace the sequence of events that led to such a tragic conclusion, the tragedy in Mavisanti. In the early hours of Saturday, June 14, 2014, the quiet town of Mavisanti was awakened by the desperate cries of a man. Peering out their windows, residents saw their neighbor, 31-year-old Carlo Lissy, calling for help. He appeared frightened and disoriented, mumbling incoherently and pleading for someone to call the police. As people from nearby homes gathered, Carlo revealed that his entire family had been victimized by intruders who had broken into their home, while he had miraculously survived because he was out with friends at a local sports bar, watching the soccer match between Italy and England. He mentioned that everything seemed normal when he left his house earlier that night, but upon returning, he found his home in disarray and the lifeless bodies of his 38-year-old wife, Cristina, their 5-year-old daughter, and their 1.5-year-old son. Neighbors immediately called the police and emergency medical services. While waiting for them to arrive, the operator asked Carlo to check if any of his family members had a pulse and to possibly start CPR if there were any signs of life. To this, he screamed that he wouldn't step inside his house again or touch the bodies. While his behavior could be attributed to shock, it was peculiar that he referred to his family members as bodies even before confirming their demise. Carlo's odd behavior didn't stop there. When police and medical personnel arrived and confirmed the deaths of his wife and children, he barely reacted. He attempted to cry, but only managed contorted facial expressions, with his eyes remaining dry and his face almost indifferent. He struggled to recall the sequence of his actions, gave conflicting statements, but claimed to have recorded the moment he discovered the bodies on his phone's camera. He believed the recording would prove his innocence, but it turned out to be one of the main pieces of evidence against him, among many others. This was the beginning of a high-profile case that was quickly solved. The robbery narrative, strongly advocated by Lissy, was dismissed within hours of the investigation, and he became the prime suspect. As the police uncovered more physical evidence at the scene of the crime and interacted further with Carlo, doubts about his mental health began to emerge. Who was Cristina Lissy? Let's start this narrative by introducing its main characters. Cristina Lissy, born Cristina Omas, came into the world on September 17, 1975, in the small northern Italian town of Pavia, becoming the eldest child in her family. From a young age, she exhibited a strong-willed, independent, and highly ambitious nature, always marching to the beat of her own drum. She possessed leadership qualities and was constantly striving to excel in whatever she undertook, whether it was her schoolwork, performances in the drama club, or any day-to-day activities. Cristina was someone who always had a wide circle of friends, thanks to her excellent organizational skills and the ability to lead. After finishing high school, she was accepted into a prestigious university in Milan and soon moved out of her parents' home to start an independent life. Despite this, she maintained a close relationship with her family, staying in constant touch, and her parents knew they could always rely on their eldest daughter. At the age of 19, while still attending university, Cristina took a job at a branch of a major Italian insurance company located in Mavisanti. She quickly earned the respect of her superiors and colleagues, and her career was on a fast track to success. Upon graduation, she had a wide array of opportunities before her, but instead of moving to a big city, Omas chose to stay closer to home in the countryside. By this time, she had already received a promotion at work and assumed a managerial position, becoming a leading specialist in the field of civil insurance. However, even as she grew into an adult and a successful woman, Cristina never gave up her youthful passion for theater. She dedicated all her spare time to rehearsals and performing on stage, particularly enjoying musical productions due to her strong voice and impeccable musical ear. In Mavisanti, she had her admirers and was sometimes even recognized on the streets. Yet Cristina's personal life didn't seem to fall into place as smoothly. She had many suitors and occasional romances, but most of the men she encountered seemed frivolous, unreliable and unsuitable for a serious relationship or family life. She held on to the belief that she would eventually find her true love and achieve happiness. Carlo Lissy, the unassuming psychopath. Carlo Lissy entered the world in the fall of 1982 in the Italian commune of Casarano as the eldest of two sons in his family. The family patriarch held conservative views, was quite strict, and even harsh with his children. Carlo's younger brother quickly became the parents' darling, constantly pampered and protected, while they demanded unquestioning obedience, stellar academic performance, and high achievements from their firstborn. From childhood, Carlo strived to meet his parents' expectations, always acting as instructed. He excelled academically, participated in volleyball, a sport his father chose for him despite Carlo's passion for soccer, and never argued with his father, who often stated that his house operated solely on his rules. It was easy to upset or anger their father, who became terrifying when enraged, so Carlo made it a point never to contradict him, always enviously observing his father's and mother's more affectionate treatment towards his younger brother. As a teenager, Carlo became nervous and withdrawn, dreaming of doing something on his own, yet fearing his father's wrath. His fears, internal struggles, and self-doubt affected his relationships with peers. Carlo had almost no friends at school, where he was seen as an uninteresting nerd, often openly bullied without the ability to defend himself, as his father had crushed his self-esteem and suppressed any desire to assert himself. Over time, Carlo learned to adapt and blend in. He avoided conflicts, tried to merge with the crowd, and was superficially polite and kind, even to those he despised. It seemed Carlo had lost his own emotions, or perhaps never had them, laughing or mourning with others, but his emotional responses always remained shallow because he never truly felt those emotions. Another trait of Carlo was his skill in dodging uncomfortable questions. He wasn't a pathological liar, but knew how to prevaricate and evade with such an impassive demeanor that it seemed he was speaking the truth. People who knew Carlo personally later recalled his diminished capacity for empathy. He could be described as callous and indifferent to the troubles and sorrows of others, including those close to him. After finishing school, Lissy enrolled in a prestigious university's economics faculty, chosen by his father, despite Carlo's disinterest in economics or working with numbers. But his opinion was never sought, and he couldn't challenge his father's decision. Thus, Carlo was accustomed to acting against his own interests just to meet others' expectations. Carlo was quite handsome and knew how to use it to his advantage. His youthful sports activities and regular gym visits in adulthood made him even more attractive. Coupled with some charm and superficial charisma, Carlo could be described as a real looker with a dazzling smile and athletic build. People often admired his looks, leading to excessive self-love and clinical narcissism. Lissy easily initiated flings with women, but was incapable of engaging in serious, long-term relationships. First, he tried to avoid any responsibility. Second, he had no interest in making long-term plans, simply going with the flow. And third, his partners soon realized he was emotionally shallow and devoid of real attachment, leading them often to initiate the breakup. Even after university, the young man continued living with his parents, showing no desire to start an independent life, let alone a family of his own. Meanwhile, he secured a job at a leading IT company in Milan. Carlo earned a good salary and faced broad prospects, but remained dissatisfied with his career. However, his parents were overjoyed, and his father seemed proud of his eldest son for the first time, so Carlo was too afraid to disappoint him, preferring to avoid conflicts and criticism. But soon, a good job and career achievements weren't enough. His parents increasingly pressured him to marry and provide them with grandchildren. Aware of his numerous fleeting affairs and his inability to maintain serious relationships, these discussions often led to arguments at home. As Carlo always tried to avoid confrontations, he assured them he would soon find a wife and start a family. Carlo and Cristina Lissy, a love story. Carlo first laid eyes on Cristina during her performance in a musical play on stage, where he was utterly captivated by her powerful charisma, and stunning vocal talent. Despite his immediate fascination, he lacked the courage to approach her after the show. However, fate intervened a few weeks later when mutual friends introduced them. At the time of their meeting, Carlo was only 23, while Christina had already turned 30. Despite the significant age difference, they quickly developed a romantic relationship. Christina, who had previously focused mainly on her career, found herself unexpectedly wanting to build a family and have children with Carlo. He was handsome, career-oriented, and intelligent. Christina perceived his hesitancy, dependency, noticeable selfishness, and some emotional coldness as traits that could be mended. She took the initiative in their relationship, with Carlo compliantly following her lead. Just a few months into the relationship, Omas introduced Carlo to her family. Christina's parents, however, were not pleased with her choice. They saw her suitor as frivolous, with Christina's mother describing him as a child in a man's body. She believed her daughter needed a more emotionally mature partner who could be a reliable support, not this immature young man. Christina, however, disagreed and decided to follow her heart, as she always had. Conversely, Carlo's parents were thrilled with his choice. Christina was seen as an adult, wise, self-sufficient, and accomplished woman who could take care of herself and their indecisive, somewhat irresponsible son. The head of the family, who was not easily pleased, was particularly delighted, convincing Carlo further that he had made the right decision. In quiet waters. About a year after meeting, the young couple moved in together and started actively planning their wedding. Carlo was quiet and compliant, always listening to his fiancée, never contradicting her, and carefully avoiding domestic disputes. Christina made all the decisions while her chosen partner silently supported them. This arrangement suited her perfectly. She was confident that a long and happy life awaited them. However, just before their wedding, Carlo revealed his true nature for the first time, nearly causing them to split. Before the wedding, Carlo's friends threw him a bachelor party in one of Milan's popular nightclubs. They drank, had fun, and were having a great time when a group of women joined them. One of them showed a keen interest in the groom-to-be, trying her best to seduce him. His inebriated friends immediately egged him on, suggesting that a fleeting affair with the stranger would be the perfect adventure to bid farewell to his bachelor life. Without much thought, the guy went off to a hotel with the woman where they spent a passionate night. The next morning, unexpectedly, Carlo confessed his love to the casual lover and promised to leave his fiancée for her. That same day, he confessed everything to Christina, stating he had fallen for someone else and no longer wanted the wedding. Christina handled the news with dignity, packed her belongings, and decided to move back to her parents' house temporarily while finding her own place. But when Carlo's father learned about his son's actions and that the engagement with Christina was broken off by his initiative, he was furious. He declared he didn't want to see his heir until he apologized to the bride-to-be and convinced her to marry him again. Once again, Carlo submitted to his father's will. After buying a huge bouquet of flowers, he headed to the Omas residence. Christina's parents opposed him. They had disliked this peculiar young man even before the news of his infidelity and the broken engagement, and now they certainly didn't want to see him. But the final decision was Christina's to make. After some thought, she decided to forgive her fiancé and give him another chance. The wedding and Mr. Lissy's double life. The wedding took place as planned, and the money gifted by relatives was invested in buying their own home in Mavisanti. Initially, their marital life seemed quite blissful. Both held high-ranking positions with substantial salaries, affording them not just the necessities, but also travel, entertainment, and more. In 2009, they welcomed their first child, a daughter named Julia, and in 2013, Christina gave birth to a son, Gabriel. To the outside world, they appeared as a happy family, full of love and understanding. Carlo seemed to do everything to please his wife, not out of deep love or respect, but rather to avoid disputes. Christina was content with their life together, oblivious to the double life her husband led. At home, he was the exemplary family man, spending time with his wife and kids. Yet in Milan, where Carlo commuted daily for work, he transformed entirely. He frequently engaged in flings and casual encounters, meeting women in cafes, shopping centers, or even on the street. The handsome, stylishly dressed man in his expensive car almost always received reciprocated interest, but these affairs typically ended after a few dates. Carlo enjoyed the control and dominance in these short-term relationships, deciding when to see his next conquest and when to leave her. At home, Cristina held the reins, with Carlo merely following her lead. However, rumors of his escapades eventually reached Cristina. Each time she confronted him, Carlo swore it was all lies and slander. In 2013, shortly after the birth of their second child, Carlo seriously considered leaving his family for one of his mistresses, to the point of admitting his intentions to his wife. Cristina countered with compelling arguments against their separation, particularly highlighting how it would upset his parents. Carlo had no choice but to concede to her reasoning, new love, and a horrific plan to escape marital ties. A year later, in early 2014, a new employee named Maria, young and attractive, joined Carlo's workplace. He fell for her instantly, unable to think of anyone else. He tried everything to catch her attention, giving small gifts, complimenting her, and asking her out repeatedly. However, Maria was clear about not wanting to engage with a married co-worker who had 2 children, but Carlo, persistent in his pursuit, seemed to ignore her protests and didn't think of giving up. Moreover, Carlo began to blame his family for his unhappiness, believing his wife and children were obstacles to his personal joy. He convinced himself he had never been happy in his marriage, or in life for that matter. But with Maria, he imagined he could have the perfect relationship. If only he wasn't bound by his marital ties and responsibilities as a father. The more he dwelled on this thought, the darker his contemplations became. Carlo broached the subject of divorce again, but his wife once more convinced him it was a bad idea, and he found no arguments to counter hers. Frustrated, he started looking online for divorce lawyers, but realized after a few consultations that he would have to surrender half of his assets to Cristina and also pay child support. Unwilling to accept such an outcome, he began researching how to end a person's life quickly and without arousing suspicion. Delving into various criminal stories, Carlo stumbled upon an article about an armed robbery that had occurred a few years prior in Mavisanti. The robbers had fatally stabbed the homeowner before fleeing with the loot, remaining undetected to this day. A monstrous plan took shape in Carlo's mind to recreate a similar robbery scenario, but this time the intended victims would be the mother and children. The last day of the Lissy family. The last day for Cristina and the children was Friday, June 13th, 2014. Carlo had the day off and spent it with his family, giving them a farewell party, so to speak. They went to an amusement park together, then went to the mall for shopping, and spent the evening at a popular local cafe. The man did his best to make sure that as many people as possible saw him and his family that day, and everyone noticed how happy they were. After returning home, the couple put the children to bed in their rooms on the second floor and went downstairs to the living room where they made love. It was part of Carlo's cunning plan to avert suspicion. He knew that the examination would establish the fact that he and Cristina had consensual intimacy, and who would think that after that a man would suddenly take the life of his wife and children? The woman knew that her husband was going to watch soccer with friends and assumed that he went to get dressed, and she herself settled down in the living room at the TV. But Carlo at that time went to the kitchen, where he took a large knife and stealthily crept up to his wife from behind. He stabbed her in the side of the neck, but Cristina not only remained conscious, but also rushed to escape. Apparently, she did not immediately realize who had attacked her, and when she turned around and saw her distraught husband with a knife in his hand, she was shocked. The victim tried to defend herself and dislodged the knife, causing the man's hand to slip and injuring his palm. Despite her efforts, the strength disparity was too great. Carlo continued his assault until Cristina showed no signs of life. She died without understanding why her loved one could commit such a horrific act. Then, Carlo went upstairs and cut the throats of his sleeping 5-year-old daughter and his 18-month-old son. Experts later concluded that the children likely did not suffer and probably didn't even wake up. Neighbors, some of whom heard loud screams, did not call the police, thinking the noise quickly subsided. Had they been more vigilant, the children's lives might have been saved. After completing the deed, Carlo clumsily staged a robbery, slightly moving and scattering items, erased his fingerprints from the weapon, cleaned the floor where he had stepped in fresh blood, and then went to a rarely used basement shower to wash off the blood. However, he inexplicably put back on the same underwear, which had small blood splatters unnoticed by him in the moment of the attack. Following this, the perpetrator bandaged his cut hand, dressed up, and casually went to a sports bar to watch football and drink beer with friends. He behaved naturally, and his friends, later testifying in court, could not fathom that he had just committed a triple homicide against his own family. Towards the end of the match, Carlo sent a couple of messages to his wife's phone, updating her on the score and professing his love, adding that he would be home soon. He returned around 3 a.m. and staged a dramatic discovery of the crime, making several critical mistakes. Firstly, he recorded the scene on his phone's camera, intending to create an alibi by pretending to discover the disorder and then the body of his wife, before running outside in panic. His second mistake was failing to turn off the camera, resulting in footage that completely contradicted his alibi and testimony, investigation, and evidence. Carlo's initial claim of a robbery was quickly dismissed in the early hours of the investigation, following the crime scene examination. Doors and windows were intact, indicating that the perpetrator had unrestricted access to the house. Nothing of value, nor anything at all, was missing despite money and Cristina's jewelry box being in plain sight. The disorder appeared staged, with items merely toppled or displaced rather than searched through. Most importantly, there was no logical reason for robbers to harm the children sleeping upstairs in their beds. Thus, the case was swiftly reclassified as a deliberate act of ending lives. Carlo, becoming the prime suspect immediately, gave inconsistent statements and couldn't clearly explain the fresh cut on his palm. When he was taken into custody and his clothing was sent for analysis, experts quickly found tiny blood splatters on them. However, Carlo claimed the blood must have come from when he attempted to revive his family members, yet the stains were too small and located on the back of his clothing, suggesting they could only have originated from the knife's motion during the act. Regarding the video Carlo provided to the authorities, it clearly showed that he didn't approach his wife's body to check for a pulse or go upstairs to the children, but ran outside immediately and didn't return. Despite this, he claimed his family was no longer alive and knew for certain all three were ended with a knife. The discovery of a bloodied cloth in the trash, which the culprit used to clean up, was the final piece of damning evidence. A psychopath, but is he sane? After the man was arrested, all his attempts to feign grief ceased. He became calm and unconcerned, and once in his cell, he simply went to sleep. Carlo felt no guilt or remorse, no pity for his own children or his wife, but he continued to insist on his own innocence, despite the fact that all the evidence was against him. A search history had been reconstructed on the killer's seized laptop, giving the investigation an insight into exactly when Lissy began planning to kill his family. There was now no doubt that it was a premeditated crime, but as yet the motive remained unclear. When the man realized that there was no point in denying, he began to confess, telling how exactly he got rid of his loved ones. But the answer to the main question shocked everyone. Explaining the motives for his action, he said that he could not just divorce Christine, because then they would have to share a lot of jointly acquired property, including the house, cars, and the family bank account. And he was not satisfied with this. In addition, there would be a burden in the form of 2 children who would have to pay child support. And all this, according to Carlo, would interfere with their happy life with Maria, for which, in fact, He decided to commit a crime. About all this, the murderer spoke quite calmly and indifferently. That he is a psychopath, no one has no doubt, but it was unclear whether this man is sane. The psychiatric examination established that Lissy was aware of his actions and fully realized what he was doing, but he did not feel any remorse either at the time of the crime or afterwards. In January 2015, Carlo was sentenced to life in prison. He listened to the judge's verdict indifferently, noting only that he thought so. Sometime later, the man tried to file an appeal, but soon withdrew it himself, saying that it was all useless. Finally, Lissy's father died of a heart attack shortly after his son was convicted and sent to prison. He simply could not accept the fact that he had raised a real monster, devoid of a sense of pity and remorse. The high-profile case of Denise Dragon is a vivid example of how youthful maximalism, morbid jealousy, and passion for illegal substances can lead to tragedy and destroy 3 young lives at once. The oldest participant, and I'm not afraid of this word, the main culprit of this story at the time of the tragedy was barely 22 years old, and the 2 girls whom he desperately tried to keep, playing with their feelings, were only 17 and 19 years old. Their love triangle didn't last long, leading to 2 pregnancies, manic stalking, and, eventually, cold-blooded murder. Mario Topanera was born in Spain in the suburbs of Madrid, a small town of Alcorcón, in 1996. The young man has never burdened himself with studying and finding a good job. In his 22 years, he lived in the house of his parents and interrupted by casual earnings. The main passion of the guy was graffiti. He drew perfectly, but he could not apply his talent as an artist anywhere, being satisfied with small part-time jobs, painting walls outside and inside buildings. Mario's main source of income was the sale of illegal substances. He did not do it himself, but found interested customers and brought them to a remote quarter of the city, where his acquaintance, who could get everything at the request of buyers. Topanera received a good percentage of each such transaction, so he was interested in finding such people. It is not known whether the parents knew what their son was doing, but if they did, they obviously turned a blind eye. It should be noted that Mario had a bright appearance and bold character. He enjoyed authority among friends and a lot of popularity among the opposite sex. The young man skillfully used his charm, easily made acquaintances, and often twirled romance with several girls at the same time, not intending to burden himself with serious relationships. Denise Maria Dragon was a native of Romania, where she was born in 2001 in the family of Emil and Daniela Dragon. The parents of the girl, at the time of her birth, were still very young and were in a difficult financial situation. Due to the circumstances, they were forced to go to work in Spain, leaving their little girl in the care of grandparents. A few years later, when the couple were able to legalize in a foreign country, get a good job and more or less establish their everyday life, they took their little daughter to their home in sunny Spain. The girl quickly settled in and made friends in her new place. She found it easy to learn the language, and at school she got high marks in almost all subjects. In addition, the little girl took an interest in dancing, willingly spent several hours a day in the studio, and regularly participated in all kinds of competitions. When the girl was in middle school, the marriage of her parents gave a crack, and they decided to separate. After the divorce, the child was left to live with her mother, but her father, despite the fact that he had a new family, continued to take care of her, in all ways supported communication, helped financially, and in every way tried to take part in the life of his daughter. Soon her mother also remarried, and a year later the girl had a younger brother, whom she adored and spent a lot of time with him. At the age of 16, Denise decided that she wanted to master the art of hairdressing and become a stylist. She left her studies and dance classes, focusing entirely on her new hobby. Her parents did not discourage her or somehow prevent her, allowing her daughter to make her own choice. To gain experience, Denise got a job in a beauty salon, which belonged to her relatives. The third heroine of this dramatic story and the final link in the love triangle was a 19-year-old girl named Rocio Martinez. She was born and raised in the suburbs of Madrid. Her father was a policeman who was transferred to Alcorcón, where his whole family moved. Rocio from childhood was impulsive, scandalous, and sometimes even aggressive. She was used to always get what she wants and did not tolerate rejection. Even at an early age, the girl was diagnosed with diabetes and serious heart problems, because of which she had to take medication on a regular basis to monitor her regimen and diet. But her health problems didn't keep her from bad company and experimenting with illegal substances. She consumed alcohol, tried drugs, and repeatedly took part in petty thefts and robberies together with her friends. However, thanks to her police officer father and his connections, Martinez was never prosecuted for her actions. Rocio believed in her impunity and that no matter what she did, her father would get her out of trouble. In addition, Rocio was quite beautiful. She always had a lot of admirers and admirers. When Denise left school and started working as a stylist, she had more free time, which she devoted to socializing with friends. Since high school, she had a best friend named Sylvia to whom Denise confided all her secrets and worries. One day, on a spring evening in 2018, walking around the city with her friend, the young lady accidentally met Mario. A handsome and cheerful guy immediately managed to charm Denise. A conversation started between them, and in the evening of the same day they exchanged phone numbers. Soon the young people had an affair. They saw each other almost daily, and their relationship developed rapidly. For the first time in her life, Denise truly fell in love, and her chosen one seemed to be her ideal. It also turned out that they had many common interests. They liked the same movies, the same music. They both adored dogs and dreamed of traveling the world. Just a few days after meeting, Denise invited her chosen one to a family dinner to introduce him to her mother. But Daniela did not approve of her daughter's choice. The woman immediately did not like Denise's lover. Something in him alerted her and even frightened her. Mother hastily made inquiries about him and was horrified when she learned that Mario is associated with the trade in illegal drugs. Daniela had a serious talk with her daughter, hoping that she would end her relationship with a guy with such a dubious reputation. Denise calmed her mother and promised her that she would break up with her lover, but in fact she continued to meet with him. Quite quickly, Denise realized that Mario is not so nice and kind as he wants to seem. The young man tried to control every step of his passport, wanted to know where she goes and with whom she communicates, without permission, took her phone and checked accounts and social networks. For several months, the girl in love hoped that her chosen one would change and they could build a strong and lasting relationship. But it only got worse. Mario began to consider her his property, which he can dispose of, and who must do everything only as he says. At the moment when Denise seriously considered breaking off the relationship, she was horrified to realize that she was pregnant. She didn't want to tie her life to this man and endure constant harassment. Besides, Denise was afraid that now Mario wouldn't leave her alone at all. On top of that, she was only 17 years old, and she herself was simply not ready for motherhood and responsibility for a new little life. Then Denise decided to talk frankly with her mother and told her everything, asking for advice on how to proceed. The woman listened to her daughter and recommended her to terminate the pregnancy, adding that the choice, in any case, will remain only for her. Denise thought it over once more and then followed her mother's advice by having an abortion. When Topanera found out about it, he was furious. The guy thought that Denise betrayed him, that she had no right to do so, and only he could decide what to do with this child. Relationships finally broke down, but the young man was not going to let Denise go and leave her alone. Moreover, he promised to take revenge on her for such betrayal and to hurt her as much as she hurt him. When Denise called her father in tears and told him about everything, Emile decided that his daughter needed to get away from all these difficult events that had shaken her peace of mind and go somewhere on vacation. He paid for his ex-wife and daughter a trip to one of the fashionable European resorts, where they went together. The vacation really did Denise good. She calmed down a little, relaxed, began to make plans for life again, and seemed to no longer think about Mario. But the vacation was over, and Denise returned home again. Mario did not long pine for his former passport, and almost immediately began an affair with 19-year-old Rocio Martinez. This fiery, aggressive, and conflicted girl was the complete opposite of the quiet and calm Denise. She could make a scandal in the same place, go into a fight, or throw a tantrum. Rocio also experimented with illegal substances and could easily break the law, knowing that she would not be punished for it, With Mario, they quickly got together and had fun together because the guy could get any illegal drug she asked for, wanting to test its effect on himself. However, Mario couldn't forget and let go of his ex-girlfriend. He still wanted to control her, to know where she was and what she was doing. Periodically, he wrote to her in social networks, called her, and even offered to resume the relationship. Denise, who had a very hard time with this breakup, met him from time to time and communicated with him, but was not going to reunite because of fear. When Martinez found out that her boyfriend was communicating with his ex, she made a terrible scandal, and in a fit of rage, screamed that she would kill them both. By that time, Mario had already realized what his chosen one was capable of, so he promised her that it would not happen again. However, Rocio's such an answer did not calm down, and she decided to destroy her rival, if not physically, then morally. Rocio began to call Denise, showering her with insults and wishing her a speedy death. But this was not enough, and she began to send messages to her rival with threats of violent reprisals. However, Dragon considered these threats to be empty words and did not consider it necessary to contact the police because of them. During that period, Rocio became pregnant, about which the first thing she wrote to her rival, saying that this child is desired and she will keep it. For Denise, this news was a painful blow. But soon Martinez, due to poor health and addiction to illegal substances, lost the child, and all her anger she again poured out in a new threatening message to Denise. Denise, eager to start a new life and soon forget about Mario, started an affair with a young man named Evan. The couple legalized their relationship just a month after meeting, and the young lady went to live in her husband's house. Apparently, Mario was hurt that his ex-girlfriend had married someone else so quickly. He started looking for meetings with her again, calling and texting her. In November 2018, when Mario and Rocio were having dinner at a small diner on the outskirts of the city, the guy went out for a while, leaving his phone on the table. Rocio, taking advantage of the moment, decided to check it out. There she came across the calls and messages Mario had been sending to Denise. Martinez immediately threw a tantrum. She screamed, cried, and tried to hit her young man. In response, Mario offered his girlfriend to personally clarify relations with Denise, to which she immediately agreed. He drove the furious Rocio to the new home of his former lover and pointed to the right door. Rocio got out of the car with a knife and went to the doorstep of her rival. At the time, Evan had not yet returned from work, and his young wife was home alone, talking on the phone with her friend Sylvia. When she heard a knock on the door, she assumed it was her husband and simply opened the door without looking through the peephole. Denise was still talking to her friend, so she could hear everything that happened next. When Denise saw her ex-lover's friend on the doorstep, she only had time to say her name in surprise and loudly before she was stabbed in the stomach. After that, Rocio immediately left, and the wounded Denise, losing consciousness, asked her friend to call an ambulance and told her who attacked her. Dragon was taken to the hospital in critical condition. Doctors fought desperately for her life for several hours, but the wound was too deep. She lost a lot of blood, and it was alas impossible to save her. After Rocio dealt the fatal blow to her rival, she ran back to the car, jumped into the cabin, and told Mario to get out of here. On the way, she confessed everything to him, and together they disposed of the crime weapon and washed the traces of blood off her hands and clothes. Mario decided it would be best for them to hide for a while. He called his relatives who lived in another city and asked them to visit. When they arrived, the relatives noticed that Rocio looked strange and was very nervous, but she wrote it off as malaise. The couple stayed overnight at Mario's relative's house, thinking about what to do and how to proceed. When they learned the next morning that Denise had died from the wound, Rocio immediately called her father and told him everything. She was sure that her dad would use all his connections to save her from jail. This time, however, the policeman father did not help his daughter, who had taken another man's life. He followed her to another city and then handed her over to the police himself. One of the main witnesses in the case was Sylvia, who at the time of the crime spoke to the deceased on the phone. The case file also included numerous threatening messages that Rocio had sent to her rival over the course of several months. The defendant initially tried to deny her guilt, but all the facts and evidence were against her. Then Rocio apparently began to lose her nerve, and she confessed to everything, giving a detailed account of the attack. She noted that it was Mario who pushed her to do it, who drove her to the victim's house and allowed her to take the knife that was in the car. Rossio suggested that he wanted to take revenge on Denise with her hands. Surprisingly, Topanera himself was only a witness in the case, not an accomplice. He completely denied his guilt and said that he only brought Rossio to his ex-girlfriend's house so that they could finally work things out and stop feuding. He also said he didn't realize Rossio had a knife and didn't see any blood on her hands or clothes when she returned to his car. At the next court hearing, the couple again denied their guilt, saying this time that they were not at the scene at all. Allegedly, they had spent the entire evening at Mario's relative's house, and Denise had been fatally stabbed by someone else. Martinez claimed that she had no hatred for her rival and had no motive to kill her. Nevertheless, Rossio's guilt was proven, and she went to prison for 18.5 years, but Mario remained completely unpunished. He almost immediately spun a new novel and, forgetting about any caution, began to brag that the girls fought him ready to kill each other. He told in detail about the events of that tragic evening, and this information quickly reached the parents of the dead Denise. The Dragon family again appealed to the court, demanding to punish the man who was responsible for the death of their daughter, and this time Topanera was taken into custody. But after a few days, the guy was released on his own recognizance. In the end, he was acquitted, and he was released again. Denise's parents tried several times to appeal the court decision, demanding to increase the term for Rossio and to put Mario in jail as an accomplice. However, to this day, Mario has not been brought to justice. Where does the line lie that once crossed, there's no return? How does an ordinary woman transform from a loving wife and beloved mother into a cruel murderer, capable of dividing a nation into two opposing groups? And how does her name become a constant topic among locals and newspaper headlines for years? Roxana Valdez could answer this question. Murderers don't stand out in a crowd, are not recognizable during dinner, and might even live under the same roof without revealing their true nature. They are indistinguishable from those who never cross that line. Thus, no one could have imagined what Roxana did on that spring evening of April 5th, 2014. And when they found out, they simply couldn't believe it. But let's start from the beginning. Little is known about Roxana's past. Despite the efforts of many Chilean reporters who competed to tell her story, they could find almost nothing about her. The only information from her criminal file was sparse. Born in a small village in the province of Punta Arenas, Chile, in 1957. That was it. Perhaps the lack of information was due to journalistic ethics, as the locals, known for their fiery temper and unique customs, might have retaliated against Roxana's relatives for her crime, potentially turning their lives into a living hell. Roxana Valdez was married to a man whose name, for reasons unknown, remains either undisclosed or unknown to the press. She had a son with him. It's clear that her marriage wasn't the dream every girl hopes for. As the couple eventually parted ways in 2011, as a single mother in a small village where jobs were scarce, Roxana faced significant challenges. In such communities, the primary occupation was growing and selling fruits and vegetables. Even the local educational institutions focused on agriculture. It was in this setting that Roxana found employment at the Don Gregorio boarding school, which trained students to become agricultural technicians. She worked as a night supervisor at the school, ensuring that students slept at night and did not engage in unruly activities. Her responsibilities didn't include the actual upbringing of the children. Roxana's son also attended this boarding school, as she worked in the fields during the day and couldn't give him the attention he needed. At the same boarding school where Roxana worked, Claudio Muñoz Ramirez held the position of head of grounds maintenance. His duties often required him to work during the night, which is how he came to meet Roxana. Despite being 14 years younger than her, they found much to talk about. Roxana would spend entire nights discussing school affairs and her own failed marriage with Claudio. They had common ground in their personal lives as well. Claudio had 2 daughters whom he adored, but felt disconnected from their mother, contemplating divorce several times. However, he remained in the marriage due to a promise he had made to her late father. Over time, Claudio seemingly forgot his promise and began spending his free time with Roxana, away from his family. Eventually, he made a decisive move. Without explaining himself to his wife, Claudio gathered his belongings and left their home. It was clear he went to Roxana, who happily welcomed him into her life. Their relationship progressed rapidly and effectively. Roxana let into her home a man she barely knew, with whom she had only enjoyed nighttime conversations. She seemed to overlook the fact that there were children around needing constant attention. Amidst these enjoyable and heartfelt talks, Roxana failed to notice Claudio's true nature. He was, in reality, quite temperamental, and sometimes even cruel. However, it was perhaps too early to judge who was more cruel between the two. The first serious outburst of aggression from Claudio took place within the walls of the boarding school. On a scheduled community cleanup day, students were assigned different areas to tidy up. Brooms, buckets, dustpans, and rags were distributed, everything needed for a thorough cleaning. As often happens, some students protested and refused to participate. Claudio, responsible for cleanliness but lacking any teaching experience, became infuriated with these students and threatened that, in the absence of teachers at night, he would beat anyone who didn't participate. Whether he would have followed through on this threat is unknown, but the students eventually started cleaning and later collectively complained to the principal about Claudio's threats of physical violence. The principal, displeased, asked Claudio to submit a voluntary resignation. It's important to note that the Don Gregorio boarding school was practically the only place in the area offering stable and reasonably paid employment. Claudio spent some time looking for work in fields and at fruit bases, but when it became clear his efforts were in vain, he and Roxana decided to seek a better life elsewhere, leaving her son in the boarding school to continue his education. They deemed it too risky to embark on this venture with him. To avoid dependency on employers, having been burned once already, the couple decided to start their own small business, a fruit kiosk. They moved to a favorable location, the commune of Molina, a couple of hours' drive from the Chilean capital. This place is well known for its vineyards, producing renowned wine brands exported worldwide. Roxana and Claudio purchased a kiosk near their new home, found suppliers for vegetables and fruits, and made their first steps in their small family business. Claudio handled the purchasing and transportation of the products from suppliers to the kiosk, while Roxana was in charge of sales throughout the day. Hiring an employee wasn't feasible, as it would mean additional expenses. Moreover, they feared that an employee might not monitor the perishable goods closely enough, leading to further losses. Claudio was visibly upset and even angry when he found out that Roxana was expecting their first child together. Perhaps it was a moment that required serious reflection, but Roxana, perhaps blinded by her new relationship and their flourishing business, didn't oppose her husband's view. She agreed that once the child was born, they would soon hand it over to her relatives for upbringing. However, it turned out there was no child to give away. Since that time, Claudio's behavior changed drastically. He often yelled at his wife and sometimes even resorted to physical violence. Neighbors from nearby houses, unhappy with their noisy new neighbors, witnessed this behavior many times and often called the Chilean police, the carabineros, to intervene and calm the domestic disputes. On one occasion, when the carabineros arrived in response to a call, they witnessed Roxana, in tears and almost half-naked, running out of the house, followed by Claudio. Roxana confessed to the officers that she was a victim of systematic domestic violence, which had led to a miscarriage. She even required psychological help after the incident. However, as time passed, the grievances were forgotten, and the troubled couple, as if nothing had happened, continued to live together as before. Following the incident, Claudio should have faced criminal charges, but a compassionate Roxana decided to give him another chance, extracting a promise that it was a one-time occurrence. Claudio vowed never to repeat such behavior, but his past actions with his ex-wife suggested his words might not hold much weight. Unfortunately, history repeated itself. Claudio temporarily ceased his physical abuse of Roxana but developed a habit of leaving home at night to drink heavily in local bars. He spent considerable amounts of their family budget not only on alcohol, but also on local women of ill repute. Roxana endured her husband's behavior, believing that Claudio would settle down once they had a child together. In a sense, she was right. In 2013, Roxana gave birth to a healthy child. Claudio stopped his carousing and fully immersed himself in their business, which now needed to expand. They purchased another kiosk in a neighboring area and another vehicle for product transportation. Roxana also invested in firearms for protection as they lived and worked in less safe areas. The family's wealth increased significantly, but only on paper. Claudio reverted to his old ways, squandering money on drinking and again resorting to domestic violence against Roxana. In Roxana's testimony, she recounted the escalating abuse in her relationship with Claudio. Initially, Claudio's drinking was infrequent, but it soon increased in frequency. He would come home inebriated, accusing Roxana of imagined infidelities, leading to physical and sexual abuse. Despite her pregnancy, Claudio's actions seemed deliberately harmful, culminating in a miscarriage in August 2012 that plunged Roxana into a lengthy depression. One night, following his usual pattern, Claudio went out to a local bar and did not return home until the next morning. Roxana, used to his behavior, still worried about him. It turned out that Claudio had stolen 5 million Chilean pesos, about $6,000, which Roxana had from selling her mother's house to spend on alcohol and brothels. This betrayal shocked Roxana, as the money was for their shared business and was hidden in their daughter's room. When Claudio finally returned home late that evening, Roxana confronted him about the missing money. Uninterested in discussing, Claudio hit her and admitted to squandering all the money. This was the last straw for Roxana. Without a word, she went to their bedroom, retrieved a revolver intended for protection against local criminals, and shot Claudio in the chest. He died instantly, surprised by her drastic action. Roxana, equally shocked by her own actions, attempted to stem the bleeding from the fatal gunshot wound, but it was too late. The close-range shot from a .38 caliber bullet was fatal. Roxana's desperate act marked a tragic culmination of ongoing domestic turmoil. Roxana's testimony reveals her profound remorse and recognition of the immorality of her actions. She confesses that when she went for the revolver, her intention was not to intimidate Claudio but to kill him. She recalls the countless times Claudio abused and assaulted her, and her failure to report him to the authorities or retract her complaint out of fear. She feared being alone even before they had a child together. After shooting Claudio, Roxana's immediate concern was the potential impact on their daughter, especially if Roxana were imprisoned and the child sent to an institution. That night, Roxana decided that the best way to deal with the situation was to dispose of the body and report Claudio missing, aware that his frequent disappearances during drinking binges were known to the police. Disposing of the body was a daunting task for Roxana, a delicate woman. She decided to remove it piece by piece. First, she used kitchen knives intended for meat cutting to sever the limbs and head. This process required 5 knives, as they kept dulling. Then she boiled the dismembered parts in the largest pots she had, all while playing with her young daughter, who was oblivious to her mother's actions and her father's fate. Roxana's calculated approach to disposing of the body while maintaining a semblance of normalcy for her daughter highlights the complexity and desperation of her situation. The day after cooking and cooling the body parts, Roxana packed them into plastic containers, organizing them separately: hands, legs, head, and torso. Each container was then placed in a garbage bag. She loaded them into her car and headed to St. Lucia to scatter the bags on a vacant lot. Before leaving, she thoroughly cleaned her house with bleach. However, once in St. Lucia, she couldn't muster the courage to dispose of the bags from her car, despite finding a suitable spot. In her testimony, Roxana expressed her internal conflict. "It's strange. I had the bravery to commit this heinous crime and dismember a human body as if it were a piglet, but I couldn't bring myself to dispose of the evidence. I was nervous throughout the drive, feeling constantly watched, fearing that police would stop and search my car at any turn. This fear led to panic, even though I had a backup plan involving my daughter, pretending to rush her to the hospital if stopped. I even thought of how to pinch her to make her cry louder." Unable to discard the remains, Roxana returned home with them, hiding the bags in the garage. She cleaned her car's interior with bleach again and visited Claudio's relatives, claiming that he had stolen a large sum of money and hadn't been home for days. They merely shrugged in response. She then visited her mother and brother. Her mother was extremely worried about Roxana's behavior. She was not eating, had a glassy-eyed look, and repeatedly asked the same questions. The only question she answered promptly was about Claudio's absence, saying he went to buy goods for their store, but had a flat tire and got delayed. Returning home and alone with her thoughts and the hidden evidence, Roxana broke down. She called her brother for help. When he arrived, she confessed everything and showed him the containers. Naturally, her brother was in shock. When Roxana called her brother, she wanted to vent and share the nightmarish years she endured with Claudio, but above all, she needed his help to get rid of the containers holding the body. However, her brother refused, fearing police involvement and the possibility of being charged as an accomplice. He urged her to confess to the Carabineros, Chilean police, insisting he would do it if she didn't. Disappointed but realizing she had no other choice, Roxana complied. That night, Roxana went to the 4th police station and announced her intention to make an important statement. The officers, familiar with her, initially thought she wanted to report her troublesome husband. However, they were shocked by her confession. Roxana was immediately arrested. The news spread rapidly throughout the area, attracting countless journalists around the station. They waited eagerly to photograph Roxana as she was led out, hoping to capture a few images and, if lucky, ask her and the officers some questions. As the journalists waited, Roxana was eventually brought out. Handcuffed and in distress, she exclaimed, "I was afraid he would kill me one day," before being escorted into a police car. The case seemed straightforward. Roxana had confessed, provided evidence, and voluntarily surrendered. However, prosecutor Monica Ballesteros wanted a deeper investigation. Skeptical of Roxana's easy confession, she requested an extended arrest to conduct a forensic examination. Ballesteros aimed to prove that Claudio was still alive during the dismemberment, which would significantly increase Roxana's sentence. The judge granted a 60-day detention for further investigation. Meanwhile, Roxana's attorney, Gerardo Gutierrez, argued that Roxana acted under extreme emotional distress, possibly exacerbated by postpartum depression and chronic domestic abuse. She emphasized Roxana's cooperation and voluntary confession as mitigating factors. However, the prosecution's theory that Claudio was alive during dismemberment crumbled after forensic results. It was confirmed that Claudio died from the gunshot wound to the chest. The bullet from the .38 caliber revolver caused a heart rupture and damaged vital organs, disproving the prosecution's initial hypothesis. Given these developments, the aggravating circumstances were dismissed. Another lawyer, Juan Pablo Cardenas, who sought to make a name for himself in this high-profile case, pointed out that the firearm used in the murder was legally registered. He also noted that Roxana's first report of domestic violence to the police was filed just 20 days after the couple started living together. Psychologist Rodrigo Valenzuela, after a medical examination, submitted documents to the court indicating that Roxana was extremely mentally unstable at the time of the crime. This meant she wasn't fully aware of her actions, and her emotional instability was linked to the loss of 2 children, one in August 2012 and another just 3 weeks before the crime. Furthermore, a forensic examination requested by the prosecutor revealed that Claudio had a high blood alcohol level of 3 grams per liter at the time of his death. On April 17, 2015, after a year of various examinations, investigations, and evidence gathering, Roxana's trial began. The media, often sensationalizing tragedies, dubbed the case the Molina Cooks case, alluding to Roxana's dismemberment and boiling of her former husband. Some unscrupulous journalists seeking to attract attention to their publications even fabricated stories that Roxana had eaten part of the remains, although this was merely a product of their imagination. Roxana, aware of the media portrayal and deeply distressed by it, refused to make any statements during the trial. The prosecutors tried to influence the judge by emphasizing that Roxana committed a grave crime by Chilean standards, patricide. However, they couldn't prove that the murder was premeditated. The defense attorney, in turn, argued that his client acted in self-defense, protecting herself from a brute who had brutally mistreated her for years. The court hearing lasted several weeks, and during this time, the entire population of Chile followed the case closely. Prosecutor Monica requested a 15-year prison sentence for the accused. However, the judges, having carefully listened to the defense and the jury's opinion, sentenced Roxana to 6 years in a correctional facility with a lenient regime. Claudio's relatives, who understandably wished for a life sentence or even execution for Roxana, and were already protesting when they heard the prosecutor asking for only 15 years, were utterly dismayed by the actual court decision. They tried to deny any violence in the family, and argued that Claudio, being a businessman and financially independent, could not have stolen $6,000 from Roxana. They also claimed that Claudio had confessed to them that Roxana often took out the revolver from the closet and told her husband that she would kill him one day. Claudio's sister, in an interview with the press, even tried to blame Chile as a state, arguing that it's a country where there is no justice, and the judicial system is utterly corrupt, given that such brutal criminals are given such short sentences, comparable to minor robberies. Even Giselle, Claudio's first wife, defended her ex-husband, assuring everyone that there couldn't have been any violence from Claudio's side. She had lived with him for many years, and during all that time, he never dared to lay a finger on her. Meanwhile, Roxana often caused disputes, motivated by her jealousy and possessiveness. Regarding Roxana's subsequent imprisonment, she spent only 2/3 of her sentence in the colony before being transferred to a semi-open education center in Talca for good behavior. Roxana was allowed to communicate with her daughter and was eventually released early. The press, of course, stirred up public interest in this case again, and the public was extremely outraged that the cook from Molina was released early. However, there were also those who, although considering Roxana a murderer, still justified her actions, seeing her as a victim in the whole situation. The debate over this case continues in the country to this day. Overall, this story highlights the grave consequences that can result if domestic violence is not addressed at early stages. In the spring of 1999, the community of Southport in the United Kingdom was split into 2 camps. The media and television were filled with numerous interviews with Mitchell Key, a man who, though unremarkable at first, had become a true folk hero. His sudden popularity was sparked by a scandal, the mysterious disappearance of his wife, Lindsay Wilson. One day, she left home without a trace, leaving behind 2 young children. Her distraught husband appeared worried and abandoned, pleading for her to reconsider and return. Along the way, he shared details of their marital life, occasionally speaking unfavorably about his spouse. He believed her behavior was driven by a desire for a free and extravagant lifestyle. Mitchell mentioned seeing his former beloved driving around town in an expensive car, although she just passed by. Most likely, the grief-stricken mother had left her children for a wealthy fiancé. Despite the image portrayed on TV and reality, he was enjoying a bachelor's life. As a result, one segment of the population sympathized with the lonely man, offering him attention and support. The other doubted him and suspected him of a horrendous crime. While Mitchell enjoyed widespread attention, law enforcement continued to search for the missing woman. His persona did not inspire trust, and there were complications in the case. According to Lindsay's relatives and friends, the couple's relationship was different from what her husband claimed. Everyone who knew her considered her a faithful wife and caring mother. Therefore, they were convinced something terrible must have happened to Lindsay. Otherwise, she would have made contact long ago. Suspicion was fueled by Mitchell's words during a famous talk show. When the host asked if he had ended his wife's life, his guest said he would not respond to such an indecent question, then paused and added, "Wait and find out." What was the exemplary husband and father implying? Perhaps he knew more than he shared, or was he so confident in his innocence that he was just waiting for everything to fall into place? Answers to these and other questions are forthcoming. Stockholm Syndrome. This is a shocking story about the terrible consequences of Stockholm Syndrome. The term refers to the traumatic bond between an aggressor and a victim, resulting in the victims sympathizing with their aggressor and often defending and justifying their actions. A decade ago, this phenomenon was examined through the lens of the relationship between a criminal and a hostage. However, today it has become widely recognized in the context of domestic relationships, explaining the behavior of a spouse enduring physical and emotional abuse from their partner. Typically, the wife adopts the role of the victim, and the husband the tyrant. In most cases, domestic Stockholm Syndrome arises among individuals with a sacrificial mindset, attracting narcissistic characters whom they wish to heal and empower. And to ensure their tormentors do not feel alone, they are ready to share their pain. Let's not delve too deeply into psychology. The essence remains the same. Often, those who become victims of abuse are kind-hearted and empathetic people. Lindsay Wilson was one of them, a young woman who wanted to love and be loved. Her primary mistake was that she failed to recognize the object of her adoration in time. And as time passed, she struggled to escape from their codependent relationship. Lindsay's story. At 17, Lindsay discovered she was pregnant. Raised in a caring, large family, she hadn't imagined becoming a mother so early. She wasn't unprepared emotionally, but the fact that her boyfriend, with whom she'd been since she was 13, fled as soon as he learned about the impending fatherhood both upset and scared her. Lindsay knew all too well the physical and financial demands of motherhood. The Wilson family, though loving and close-knit, had often faced financial challenges. To provide for their children, her parents worked tirelessly. Therefore, when Lindsay met Mitchell Quee 5 months into her pregnancy, she considered it a gift of fate. Mitchell, a 20-year-old, acted like a true gentleman, being attentive and caring. Most importantly, her delicate condition did not deter him. Mitchell assured her he had fallen in love with Lindsay at first sight and wanted to spend his life with her and raise the child as his own. At that time, he was earning well and even started working extra hours so his beloved would want for nothing. The young couple's parents were shocked when they announced their decision to marry. They felt the 5-week-old relationship hadn't withstood the test of time and circumstances, and thus couldn't genuinely celebrate for them. The only thing Lindsay's relatives noted was that her former cheerfulness and good health had returned. At the same time, the new boyfriend seemed overly sweet to them, even cloyingly polite. Ultimately, no one interfered with their marriage, keeping their doubts to themselves. Red flag. The wedding took place in August 1995 within a close family circle. The majority of the guests were from the bride's side. The groom's side was represented by no more than 5 people: his parents, a brother, and 2 friends. During the celebration, Lindsay was ecstatic, believing she had won the lottery in life. However, the uneasy premonitions of Lindsay's relatives grew heavier when, by the end of the evening, the newlyweds had a dispute. The conflict unfolded before everyone's eyes. Something displeased Mitchell, and he started to shout loudly. It was unlikely that the reason was significant or appropriate for such a reaction. During the argument, he grabbed his new wife by the hand and started shaking her, which looked more than odd and threatening. Lindsay tried to calm him down. When the emotions subsided, the man apologized to everyone and later made light of the incident, emphasizing that it was just nerves due to the holiday bustle. At that moment, the girl did not give due attention to the situation and quickly forgot about it. However, in reality, it became one of the red flags in their toxic relationship. Diligent specialist. On February 5, 1999, a social worker officially reported Lindsay Key missing, expressing concern over being unable to reach her client. Lindsay had sought psychological support in a short period of their life together due to recurring incidents of domestic violence, and had bravely reported the situation at home. After her disclosure, the social worker had been monitoring the young family. She informed the police that she had been unable to contact Mrs. Key for several weeks. Every time she visited the home, Lindsay's husband would answer the door, and he was also the first to answer any phone calls. The dedicated worker mentioned that she repeatedly asked to speak directly to Lindsay, but received evasive excuses. During her visits, she consistently left her contact details, yet Lindsay never called back. The social worker found this situation unsafe and requested a welfare check. Law enforcement responded to the report and visited the address, but were also unable to speak with Lindsay. Her husband Mitchell explained that he had not seen his wife at home for a long time, but did not consider her missing. According to him, on Christmas Eve, Lindsay had gone to a party with a friend and returned home early in the morning, somewhat intoxicated. They had an argument afterwards. Lindsay then packed her belongings and left without saying goodbye to the children. He claimed she left him for another man and no longer wanted any contact. Search efforts. The search for Lindsay began. During conversations with her relatives, Officers learned that she was last seen by her family on December 11th, appearing in high spirits and looking well, and her behavior was normal. Her family had grown accustomed to her troubled marriage. Lindsay's mother also reported that she had tried multiple times to reach her daughter on December 24th to arrange a visit to give Christmas gifts to the grandchildren. Unable to reach Lindsay, she decided to visit in person. That day, Mitchell answered the door with the children and told her that his wife had left with friends and accused her of infidelity. However, Mrs. Wilson had long learned to take her son-in-law's words with a grain of salt. After giving the gifts to the children, she left. Detectives found it strange that no one had been concerned about the young woman's well-being for 2 months. However, there was an explanation. Everyone knew that Mitchell restricted his wife's interactions with the outside world, even with close relatives. They had previously experienced difficulty communicating with her. Therefore, it was plausible for Lindsay to drop out of sight for a while. Nonetheless, this did not mean they were not concerned about her. The news alarmed them. Everyone asserted that she did not drink and led a modest lifestyle. Moreover, her husband had forbidden her all contact with the outside world, not to mention meetings with friends and acquaintances. Inconsistencies, everything Mr. Key told the police contradicted his character profile, arousing investigators' suspicions. It seemed unlikely that Mitchell could simply let his wife go, and that Lindsay would leave her children with a tyrannical husband. However, the situation demanded a thorough investigation. To this end, the police spoke with all of Lindsay's acquaintances and tried to find anyone who had seen her after the family gathering. They also questioned neighbors and requested surveillance footage from the residential complex where the couple lived and its surroundings. Unfortunately, all footage had been deleted. By the time Lindsay's disappearance was noted, some time had elapsed. However, another date was discovered when she was last seen in person. On December 15th, she was at the local post office, sending several letters and postcards as usual. Her older sister also admitted that they met that day. Lindsay had visited despite Mitchell's disapproval. The sisters had tea and a brief conversation, after which Lindsay saw her guest out. On the way, she slipped a note into her sister's hand and asked her to read it later. The sister put the note in her purse and in the whirlwind of days, forgot about it. Regrettably, the older sister couldn't find it later, and its contents remain unknown. After that day, no one saw Lindsay again. Over several months, investigators tried to cling to any information. They began to suspect that she was no longer alive, as she had not been in contact for so long. They couldn't charge Mitchell without sufficient grounds and evidence. However, the more they learned about the couple's life history, the stronger their suspicions grew. Marriage. Shortly after their wedding, Mitchell and Lindsay decided to move away from their parents. They rented an apartment in Southport. Sometime later, Lindsay gave birth to a daughter named Robin. The only shadow over the joy of the new baby was her stepfather's volatile temper. After moving, the young wife fully experienced her husband's unstable moods. One moment he could be joking and laughing, the next he became unbalanced and aggressive. Trying to maintain a fragile peace at home, she didn't realize how completely she had submitted to his will. He controlled every step she took and caused a scene whenever she failed to hear the phone or answer a call. However, loud arguments were often followed by passionate reconciliations. Mitchell would kneel, beg for forgiveness, and profess his love. It seemed for a while that peace had returned to the family. But then, the cycle would start again. Conflict, reconciliation, repetition. Lindsay began to lose recognition of the man she loved. She often told her relatives about what was happening. They advised her to return home and end her suffering. But it was hard for the young woman to admit her mistake. In one interview, the Wilsons mentioned that she always lived with thoughts of the past. Each time, her husband assured her he would change and everything would be fine. As a loving wife, she wanted to believe him and waited for him to return to his former self, gentle and caring. Meanwhile, Mitchell increasingly tightened his grip and control. He forbade his wife to go out alone in the evenings and eventually restricted her from being anywhere without him. He was jealous of her every move, yet he himself was seen in dubious liaisons. Once, Lindsay confided to her older sister that she suspected her husband of infidelity. She told her about a woman who came to their home looking for him and was very surprised to learn he was married. That day, another argument erupted, but this time it escalated to physical violence. Gradually, physical abuse became a part of their life. To prevent his wife from complaining about him and tarnishing his reputation, the man began to limit her interactions, starting with neighbors, friends, and acquaintances, and later with her family. Despite being unhappy, Lissy still tried to maintain contact secretly, fearing being discovered and punished. At the same time, despite the evident problems, Lissy continued to stay with Mitchell. Along with her feelings, the comfortable life he provided was a factor. He earned well, supporting her and their child, paying the bills. She truly lacked nothing financially. Second chance. The era of living in a gilded cage came to an end for Mrs. Key when she found out she was pregnant again. At that moment, she was certain she no longer wanted more children. It's only fair to note that Mitchell was good to his stepdaughter, even loving her. However, Lissy deemed the current circumstances unfavorable for bringing another child into the world and decided to terminate the pregnancy. When her husband learned of this, he became enraged, hurling insults and physically intimidating her. That same evening, she packed her things, took her child, and returned to her parents' home. Her family breathed a sigh of relief. There she proceeded with the pregnancy as she had planned. Over time, however, she began to miss her husband. He wouldn't leave her alone, frequently calling and begging her to come back. Mitchell tried everything to prove he had changed. Eventually, he managed to convince Lissy. Initially, everything went well, and it seemed as if their old feelings had returned. The Keys were expecting another child. This peace lasted for 6 months until Mitchell had a severe anger outburst. Fortunately, he did not direct his rage at his pregnant wife, but took it out on the apartment. He smashed everything he could see, destroyed furniture, ripped doors off their hinges, and even stained the walls with blood and food remnants. He threw the television out of the window and smashed the car parked outside. The landlord demanded not only compensation for the damage and repairs, but also that they vacate the apartment. This situation worsened the family's financial position, requiring additional expenses. As a result, the couple had to take out a large loan and move to a more modest apartment. You can't run from yourself. In October 1997, their son Jack was born. The father adored the boy. However, the relationship between the spouses became increasingly tense. Throughout their married life, Mitchell frequently left home, sometimes for a few days, sometimes for a week, often over trivial or fabricated reasons. Lissy had grown accustomed to her husband's behavior. Yet, when he abandoned her again, she filed for divorce and returned to her parents' home. Apparently, she realized she couldn't cope with the separation on her own. Therefore, she reached out to a local charity that assists women in difficult life situations. They helped her find subsidized housing in another city. Lissy feared that Mitchell would discover her new address or phone number, so she took measures to distance herself from him. After he made several threats, she even obtained a restraining order from law enforcement. With the help of a therapist, she began to rebuild her life. She started a journal where she documented her life and experiences, intending to leave it to her children so they would never repeat her mistakes. The entries confirmed the relatives' claims about the difficult dynamics within the family. Despite her precautions, Mitchell discovered her phone number and incessantly called, demanding to see his son. With her newfound freedom, Lissy felt lonely, and after a short time, she could not resist his persistence. They began communicating and seeing each other again, and eventually moved back in together. The mother of two was ashamed to admit her own weakness, so she told no one about it. Nevertheless, the secret came out. Relatives and friends were shocked and disappointed by the reunion with the tyrant. They couldn't understand why she had let him back into her life. Mitchell remained unpopular with Lissy's relatives. They, too, wanted nothing to do with him. Ultimately, their communication nearly ceased. Despite all efforts, Lissy repeatedly returned to the abusive relationship. Thus, her circle saw no point in trying to save her anymore, accepted the situation, and stepped back. However, this time, her decision proved to be fatal. Villain in disguise. At the outset of the investigation into Lissy's disappearance, Mr. Key was initially helpful in the search efforts. However, as the case gained media attention, his focus shifted dramatically. He turned his misfortune into a public spectacle, becoming a media figure in the process. As Mitchell invited more journalists into his home, his abundant media appearances began to seem less genuine, with viewers often noting a smirk on his face. Lindsay's parents considered their son-in-law to be involved in their daughter's disappearance, and detectives also viewed him as the prime suspect. Yet, the lack of direct evidence tied their hands. Searches were conducted not just at the couple's home, but throughout the area. After a provocative question during a televised interview, the antagonist became even more brazen, even declaring that the time would come when his wife's family would have to apologize for their suspicions. On the eve of the holiday season, Mr. Key sent a postcard to the lead investigator on the case. Attached to it was a pack of hair dye. Instead of a festive greeting, Mitchell wrote, "I hope this covers your gray and gives you a bit more confidence," mocking the detective and displaying his own arrogance. In the media, he had already played the victim of not only marital infidelity, but also of harsh treatment by authorities. To put this upstart in his place, the investigation team gave an interview. Without revealing all the details of the case, they hinted that the well-known family man was not who he claimed to be. Tarnished reputation. In February 2000, Mitchell Key found himself at the center of a scandal. It became known that he had been forging his wife's signature to receive social benefits, serving as another indirect proof of his involvement in Lindsay's disappearance and presumed demise. The investigators wanted to latch onto a financial motive. However, the suspect's popularity worked in his favor. Many supporters emerged, arguing that as a single father, he had every right to financial assistance. These circumstances hindered the detectives' ability to bring the charges they desired. Nevertheless, they managed to charge him with fraud. Mr. Key was brought to court for the benefit fraud and was found guilty, sentenced to a month of community service. This time, Mitchell couldn't walk away unscathed. The forgery of his missing wife's signature appeared more than suspicious. The number of angry comments increased. Eventually, the man's patience snapped, and he began lashing out, blaming the media for intruding into his personal life. A new beginning. The case of Lindsay Key's disappearance might have remained unsolved had it not been for a clue discovered by chance. On June 1st, 2000, a park-goer noticed his dog acting strangely near the roller coaster at a city amusement park. The animal uncovered human remains. Specialists were called to the scene, and the remains were sent for forensic examination, which revealed that they were parts of a female torso. Genetic testing confirmed they belonged to Lindsay Key, who had been missing for a long time. This breakthrough revitalized the investigation, making it clear that Lindsay had been the victim of a brutal crime. The focus now was to find the perpetrator. On June 7th, Mitchell was brought in for questioning. The detectives were determined, and after more than 36 hours of intermittent interrogation, the suspect broke down under the pressure and confessed. Dismemberment murder. On December 15th, 1998, after meeting with her sister, Lindsay informed her husband that she wanted a divorce. This time, she was resolute. According to Key, this news infuriated him, leading him to attack and strangle her. The incident occurred in front of their children. He then hid her lifeless body in their bedroom, stuffing the gap under the door to mask any odors. Realizing he couldn't dispose of the body alone, he enlisted the help of his brother Elliot, a butcher who he thought could assist. Elliot was initially hesitant, but was eventually persuaded by Mitchell. While the children played in the next room, they dismembered Lindsay's body and later dispersed her remains across the city. During his confession, the murderer expressed no remorse or empathy. Instead, he seemed proud of his actions, stating that without his confession, they would never have proven his guilt. The next day, he led them to the other locations where he had hidden her limbs. Sadly, her head and one hand were never recovered. The forensic comparison confirmed that the remains were indeed Lindsay's. There was no doubt about Mitchell's guilt. The final judgment. The trial of the Key brothers took place in January 2001. The court proceedings were swift and straightforward. Mitchell was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 17 years. The court-appointed psychiatrist noted that the defendant showed all the signs of being a narcissist with sadistic tendencies. His brother Elliot received a 7-year sentence for his role in concealing the crime. Lindsay's children were taken in by her maternal grandparents, who gave them their surname. Just 3 months after the sentence was handed down, another tragedy struck the Wilson family. One of Lindsay's older brothers, unable to cope with the shock, took his own life in the attic of their family home. In his farewell note, he wrote that he saw no point in continuing in such a cruel world and wished to reunite with his sister. As of 2017, Mitchell Key has been eligible for parole. However, as of January 2023, his lawyers have been denied 3 times. The Wilsons, including the children, are concerned that the murderer might eventually be released. Consequently, they have started a petition urging that he remain incarcerated. As long as the voices of the victim's family are considered, the criminal will continue to serve his sentence. Regardless, no punishment can bring Lindsay back. In an interview, Mr. Wilson mentioned hearing rumors that his former relative had attempted to end his life. He added that he sincerely hopes the murderer will try again and succeed this time. Experience shows that most women with domestic Stockholm syndrome try to adapt to their abusers throughout their lives. Even when their families come to their aid, they continue to act against their own best interests. In such cases, only deep self-reflection and psychotherapy can help. If the victim does not come to realize the recklessness of their actions, the end of the relationship will be dire. Jealousy is a terrible, often destructive force that can blind a person and push him to crime. It was jealousy that caused the tragedy that played out in Costa Rica a few years ago. This case went down in the history of forensics as the case of Gerardo Cruz. But let's talk about everything in order. Samody Fonseca was born in Costa Rica in February 1975. About her family and early years are known a little. The girl's childhood was in an area called Cuba, where she lived with her mother named Sonia Fonseca. Samody attended one of the local schools and even then demonstrated her difficult and conflicted character. She did not tolerate rejection, often achieved what she wanted by force or deception. According to the memories of local residents, Samody, thanks to her striking appearance and perfect figure, easily charmed men, but could not keep them. Samody was very beautiful and skillfully used her appearance, but because of greed and vanity, put material wealth and self-interest above all else, which simply discouraged cavaliers after a short relationship. In addition, she was incredibly jealous and aggressive. In her youth, Samody Fonseca, thanks to her doll-like appearance, worked for several years in the image of Barbie in one of the large bookstores of the company Universal. It was then that the girl received such a flattering nickname, firmly entrenched behind her for life. Soon after graduating from high school, Samody had an affair with a successful journalist who worked on local television. The man's name was Osvaldo Fernando Baleri, and he was 16 years older than her. It was the longest and most serious relationship Samody, but the chosen one never made her an offer. In 1996, the couple had a common son, Christopher, and a year later their daughter Christina was born. But because of constant scandals and attacks of jealousy Samody, Baleri left the young woman. In 2012, 53-year-old Osvaldo died suddenly, and, as it soon turned out, he did not enter the former lover in his will. The young woman was not going to put up with it, and decided to take matters into her own hands. She went to the house of a former lover and actually seized it, changing the locks there so that relatives and heirs of the deceased could not get in. In addition, Samody took some valuable items belonging to the deceased. The Baleri family members were quite outraged and immediately went to court to punish Samody for the theft. The police forced the young woman to leave the house, but criminal proceedings against her were not initiated. Fonseca had many other romances, in particular with Juan Miguel Angel Perez, from whom the woman gave birth to her third child, a daughter named Maria. According to some reports, this relationship was officially registered, but ended in divorce after a few years, although other sources claim that Samody was not married. At the same time, she gave her youngest daughter her lover's surname without his knowledge or consent. It is a curious fact that some lovers of Barbie mysteriously disappeared or died under mysterious circumstances, but for a long time, for some reason, no one paid attention to it. So, for example, one of Samody's lovers went missing, and according to relatives, it happened soon after he decided to break up with an irascible and aggressive lady. The man to this day has not been found, and many are sure that Fonseca is directly related to this case, but some irrefutable evidence of her guilt could not be found. Samodi's other former lover, whose name was Diogo, died tragically after breaking up with her. He was murdered, and everything looked like a failed robbery attempt, and the mysterious killers were never brought to justice. Again, everyone speculated about Samodi's involvement in the crime, but no hard evidence was found against her. However, her most famous victim was Gerardo Cruz. Cruz, a native of Costa Rica, he was born in December 1992 in the city of San Jose. His own father, the boy did not know, because he left the family before the birth of his son. His mother, Ana Patricia, soon married a man named Hermes Rodriguez, who adopted the baby and raised him as his own. And a few years later, Gerardo had a younger sister, Milena. Childhood and youth of the guy can be characterized as a calm and carefree period. He studied at an ordinary school, was fond of motorcycles, and early met his true love, a girl named Carol. At the age of 23 years, Gerardo, along with his chosen one and their common daughter, 4-year-old Genesis Cruz, settled in the house of his aunt and uncle in the metropolitan suburb of San Sebastian. The young father took a job at a local bakery to provide his family with everything they needed. The couple was quite happy, and soon they learned about the upcoming addition to their family for the second time. In the summer of 2015, Gerardo met Samodi, who periodically shopped at the bakery where he worked. At that time, the woman was already 40 years old, but she was still quite attractive, loved to wear frank outfits and flirt. It is worth noting that with age she began to have affairs with men who were much younger than herself, because the attention of young lovers probably flattered her. Despite the almost 20-year age difference in the presence of a family, Cruz quickly became infatuated with a beautiful woman and began to secretly meet with her. She herself began to visit the bakery almost every day to be able to see her young lover, which did not escape the attention of other employees. In addition, Samodi often appeared accompanied by her eldest daughter, Christina, who was 19 years old at the time. At first, Gerardo managed to masterfully combine family life and secret meetings with his mistress, and so that none of his women did not realize the existence of a rival. But soon Gerardo, as they call it, lost his guard. Obviously, he wanted to boast of his success with women, and he began to tell friends and colleagues about Samodi, about what she is a terrific mistress and spoils him with gifts. Rumors quickly reached his mother, who tried to reason with her son and convince him to leave his mistress. The affair lasted only a few months and broke off in October that same year, 2015, when Samodi found out that the lover had a pregnant wife and a young daughter. The woman was furious. She started calling and texting Carol, insulting her and threatening to kill Gerardo if he didn't belong to her alone. Gerardo managed to beg his wife's forgiveness and keep the family together. As for the former mistress, he did not take her threats seriously, believing that she would quickly cool down and find a new boyfriend. He did not even realize how insidious and vindictive Samodi would turn out to be. Just a few days after the breakup with Fonseca, Cruz became an accidental witness to a blatant scene. As the young man was walking down a downtown street, he saw a certain older man trailing behind a young girl, holding his phone in such a way that the camera was positioned under her miniskirt. The guy was outraged. He also took out his phone and started filming what was happening, then stopped the girl and told her about everything, advising her to go to the police. Cruz then chased after the man, trying to capture his face on camera. He chased him for about 2 minutes, wondering loudly if he was having a good time taking pictures of the girl's underwear without their knowledge, until the man jumped into a cab and drove away. That same night, Gerardo posted the video he had made on his internet page, and in just one night, the video went viral as users quickly identified the elderly man as a former official, an employee of the Ministry of Finance named Luis Sulmano Delgado. Soon, the video was picked up and circulated by the media, and Gerardo himself became a national celebrity. The young man was interviewed almost daily for print publications. He was invited to television and radio programs. He talked about the incident he had witnessed, condemned the actions of the former official, and said that he had no regrets about his action and would do it again. At the same time, experienced lawyers hired by Sulmano Delgado began working against Gerardo, accusing him of wrongdoing. They claimed that the distribution of the videotape made by the guy violated the law and were preparing a lawsuit against him in court. Cruz himself was quite surprised by this turn of events and did not understand why they can judge him, and not the man who committed such a disgusting act against an innocent girl. Gerardo gave his last interview on October 7th on the air of one of the local radio stations. He was sure that he was right and believed that he had nothing to fear. The next day, Gerardo had arranged to meet with his friend Oswald after work, but he abruptly canceled the meeting, citing a sudden emergency. As it later became known, that day, he received a message from Samodi, in which a young woman tricked him into coming to the park in the evening, where he was supposed to be interviewed again. Gerardo didn't even suspect anything wrong and simply believed his former lover. After the end of his shift, he went to the agreed place, but there were not journalists waiting for him, but two unknown men who took away his bag, beat him and stabbed him several times in the chest and stomach, and then fled. The injured man, before losing consciousness, managed to call his friend and report what had happened, and the latter immediately called the police and medics. Thanks to his prompt action, Gerardo was taken to hospital, where doctors fought for his life for 42 days. During this time, Gerardo underwent dozens of operations, but alas, to save him failed. On November 19th, Cruz died in the intensive care unit. Since shortly before the tragedy, he became a real celebrity. His condition, without exaggeration, followed the whole country. Gerardo's relatives periodically gave interviews in which they asked all concerned to pray for his recovery. They themselves did not understand who and why could do such a thing to Gerardo. At the funeral of the guy came a lot of people who wanted to express their condolences to his family. Also, everyone expressed hope that the police will quickly get on the trail of the killers and they will be fairly punished. Initially, there were several versions of the crime. The first was that it was a robbery murder. Indeed, Gerardo was attacked in the park in the evening. His bag was taken away and he was stabbed with a knife so that it looked like a common thief. However, just a few days before, Cruz had released a sensational video compromising a nationally known former official. Hence the second theory, a revenge killing. The media openly said and wrote that Sulmano Delgado could well have hired hitmen to remove the young man who had spoiled his reputation. The murder was hotly debated in the press, and people picketed the streets demanding that the killers be found and jailed. The police began to put forward and consider different versions, as well as to look for other possible enemies and ill-wishers of Gerardo. For several months, the investigation stood still, until in May 2016, a video from a street surveillance camera was discovered. The footage shows two men running away from the scene where Cruz was fatally shot. These men immediately became prime suspects, but it was up to the police to identify and track them down. The tape turned out to be a key piece of evidence, and once it was made public, the case moved forward. It was repeatedly played on news programs, asking viewers to look closely, because these could be dangerous criminals. In addition, the police were able to draw up rough sketches of the wanted men and describe their anthropometric data. Soon the identity of one of the men was established because he himself decided to surrender to the police and cooperate with the investigation in the hope that it will help him to mitigate the sentence. Thanks to the information he provided, the investigation quickly came to several other accomplices, as well as the organizers of the crime, Somadi and her daughter Christina. Soon all participants in the crime were taken into custody. In addition to the mother and daughter, several other men were arrested. Cab driver Ronald Archie, who found the perpetrators of the murder, laborer Cesar Chavez, who acted as an intermediary, and a young minor who was directly involved in the attack. Omar Costa, who had been following the victim and reporting his whereabouts on the day of the attack, was also later arrested. The roles and connections of all the participants in the crime were established through phone calls and text messages. The murder was ordered by Samodi, who had planned the whole thing carefully, including her daughter Christina in the details of the plan. Together, they turned to their friends Ronald and Caesar to help them find a couple of hitmen to kill Gerardo and make it look like a robbery gone wrong in a night park. They were later joined by Omar, who had to make sure the victim went to the agreed-upon location. Samodi chose the date of the massacre herself, October 7th, On that day, she repeatedly contacted all the participants in the crime, assigned roles, and made sure that everyone followed the plan. In addition, the young woman demanded that after committing the crime to bring her something of the former lover's belongings as evidence. Cruz, after working his shift, headed straight for the park. He was sure that he was going for an interview, so he tried not to be late for the meeting. But at the agreed place he was attacked, stabbed several times, and then took his bag and jacket, which were given to the customer as evidence. The main evidence of Samodi's guilt were the text messages in which the murder plan and the roles of each of the participants were described in detail. The woman was so confident in her impunity that she did not even bother to delete them. The motive for committing such a grave crime was banal jealousy. The woman did not want to share a lover with his wife, and decided that if he was not with her, then no one would get it. She thought everything through and involved in her criminal plan her own daughter, who helped her in everything. Mother and daughter were immediately taken into custody, and the fact that to release them on bail was out of the question, because the criminals would probably make an attempt to escape and leave the country. Their accomplices also ended up in pre-trial detention, except for Omar, who was in charge of surveillance, and the youngest participant in the crime was handed over to authorities specializing in juvenile delinquency. The investigation lasted about a year and a half, and only in December 2017, the trial of all participants in the criminal conspiracy began. In addition, it turned out that Samodi had previously been brought to criminal responsibility several times. In particular, she was arrested for forging documents to receive state payments, but then she got off with only a fine. In addition, the story of Miguel Angel Perez, the father of Samodi's youngest daughter, has surfaced. As it turned out, the young woman gave the child's surname of a former lover without his consent, and then through the court obtained from him the payment of alimony which she received more than 3 years. When it turned out that the whole procedure was falsified, the swindler was sentenced to 3 years in prison and a large fine. But the court took into account the fact that she had a small child and commuted the sentence to a suspended 5-year sentence. At the trial, the wife of the murdered Gerardo admitted that she knew about his affair with Samodi and that the former mistress had threatened him with death, but he did not pay much attention to the threats. The main motive of the crime, as already mentioned, was jealousy and wounded pride of the woman, who could not accept the fact that her young lover preferred to stay with his wife. Thanks to the records of phone calls, it was found out that the mother and daughter planned the crime together. It also became known that after the release of the very CCTV footage that captured the killers, Christine had a nervous breakdown. She called her mother, sobbing, and was on the verge of going to the police to confess, but she calmed her daughter, assuring that the investigation will never come out on them. The verdict was not announced until January 23, 2018. According to the court decision, Samodi was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Her daughter, as well as Ronald and Caesar, received 25 years in prison each. One of the killers went to a juvenile detention center, and the second was not found at that time. Omar, on the other hand, who had been following the victim, was acquitted. The family of the victim received $140,000 as moral compensation. After the announcement of the verdict, the relatives expressed gratitude to the court for the fair punishment for the killers of Gerardo. However, it soon became known that the lawyers of Samodi and Christina appealed to the appeals court to mitigate the sentences. The new trial took place in November 2019. At the same time, the identity of the second killer became known, who, according to Ronald, took part in the massacre but was not privy to the details of the plan. Ronald and Caesar also appealed to the appeals court, hoping to reduce the sentence. As a result, the sentence for each of the participants in the crime was reduced by 5 years. Now, Samodi is serving his 25-year sentence in one of the women's prisons in Costa Rica. As it became known in the summer of 2020, she registered a marriage with a woman with whom she met in prison. Her chosen name is Lindsay Diaz Lopez, and at the time of registration of the relationship, the one has already managed to leave the prison walls, released on parole, while Samodi will spend almost 2 decades behind bars. In psychology, there is a special term called Adélie syndrome, which refers to the morbid obsession of one person with another. The affliction received its name in honor of the youngest daughter of the famous French writer, Adelie Hugo. She was a very attractive girl and a talented pianist, but unrequited love noticeably affected her mental state. As a result, the beauty simply poisoned the life of herself and her lover, who for years pursued, pretending to be his wife, then ruined his career and personal life. Unfortunately, 43 years of her 84 years, Adele spent in the walls of a psychiatric hospital. It is worth noting that the condition in which one person is overly interested in, or even obsessed with, another so much that he loses the ability to control his emotions, a fairly common phenomenon. In most cases, an experienced psychologist can help. Sometimes hospitalization and more thorough therapy are required, but sometimes such obsession borders on insanity, pushing a person to desperate, unpredictable, and extremely cruel actions. The case of Emma Youngstig in 2008 shook the whole of Europe and became one of the most brutal in the history of Swedish forensic science. The perpetrator could be recognized as insane, and because of the lack of hard evidence, the case and even wanted to close, but he showed his true face in the courtroom. An immature young family, Emma Youngstig was a native of Stockholm, where she was born on February 16, 1985, where almost all of her childhood and adolescence passed. She was brought up in a simple family where she was the younger of 2 daughters and grew up with her older sister, Katharina. At the age of 19, the girl married a young man named Nicholas, with whom she began dating while still in high school. The chosen one was not much older than the girl, and at the time of marriage the bride was already expecting a child. In 20 years, Emma first became a mother, giving birth to a son who was named Max, and a year and a half later she gave birth to a second child, a daughter, Saga. But, despite the appearance of 2 common heirs, the couple were still too young and were not ready for family life and the hardships of everyday life. They constantly quarreled over trifles, could not find a common language, and soon after the birth of their daughter, decided that they should separate. But then, the question of custody of children, which was solved very hard and painful. Nicholas sought not only to help the children financially, but also to take a direct part in their lives and upbringing. Emma was not against it, but soon she had a new romantic relationship. She moved to a small town called Arboga, located about 150 kilometers from Stockholm, to her new lover, and took the children with her. The ex-husband was against it, because he wanted to be able to see his daughter and son every day. Ex-spouses repeatedly met in court to settle the matter, and Nicholas even threatened Emma, which she immediately reported to the police. Problems could not be solved peacefully in any way, and each of the parents began to seek sole custody. New love. Emma met a guy named Torgny Hellberg through the internet. They quickly found a common language, got close, and a romantic relationship began between them. The young man was not confused by the fact that the 23-year-old girl already has 2 heirs from a previous marriage, because he had long dreamed of a family and was ready to accept them as his own children. The newly married couple first lived in a small house, which was inherited by Torgny by inheritance. But when the lovers decided to get married, they moved to a larger house, where they could live comfortably, and each of the children would have their own cozy room. The man at that time had a good job with a decent salary, and Emma was engaged in raising small children as well as creating a home, but, being a designer by education, was going to work in the future in the specialty. The couple planned to play a wedding in the summer of 2008, but these plans were not destined to fulfill. Brutal massacre. March 17, 2008 was an ordinary Monday. Torgny went to work early in the morning and Emma stayed home with 3-year-old Max and 1.5-year-old Saga. In the evening, the girl was preparing dinner, waiting for her fiancé to return, and at the same time, she was chatting online with her sister, Katarina, discussing a gift for their parents' upcoming wedding anniversary. At about 6:30 in the evening, Emma received a call from Torgny, warning her that he was late for work. He said they could start dinner without him. After the brief phone conversation, Emma continued with her household chores, fed the children, and then sat down at the computer again, continuing to text with her sister. At 07:07 p.m., their communication was abruptly interrupted, literally half a word. Katerina thought it was very strange, because she saw that her sister was typing a message to her, but for some reason never sent it. 5 minutes later, a worried Katerina called Emma, but she didn't pick up. Then she dialed Torgny's number to find out what had happened. The young man was on his way home from work and was just approaching the house, so he assured Katerina that everything was fine, that Emma was probably distracted by the kids, and that she would call her back as soon as she could. When the man arrived at the threshold, he was surprised to find that the front door was unlocked. When he went inside, he immediately noticed the mess, thinking that the children had made a mess while playing. But then he saw brown stains and stains on the floor, realizing with horror that it was blood. Hellberg called Emma and the children's names loudly several times, but no one responded. In the hallway on the floor, the man saw a strange object, thinking at first that it was a doll, because the figure was lying in a completely unnatural pose. As he got closer, however, he realized that it was Saga in a pool of her own blood. Her head and face were disfigured beyond recognition and turned into a bloody mess. A little farther away lay her brother in a similarly horrifying state, with a fractured skull. Their mother was also lying on the floor, covered in blood and in an unnatural posture. Her face was badly shattered and disfigured. It seemed that all of them were no longer showing signs of life. Shocked, Tony pulled out his cell phone with trembling hands and dialed the emergency number, reporting what had happened. At that moment, Emma shuddered and let out a loud, long groan. Police officers and paramedics immediately arrived on the scene and found a weak pulse in all three victims and quickly began resuscitation. The picture was horrifying. No one understood what kind of beast could do this to a young woman and her children. But saving their lives was the priority. So, first of all efforts were thrown at getting the victims of the attack to the nearest hospital for assistance. Fighting for lives and the beginning of the investigation. From the outset, the arriving paramedics expressed doubts about whether the victims could be brought to the hospital alive at all. However, all three were still alive when they arrived at the medical facility. All were diagnosed with open head injuries, with severe brain damage and extensive blood loss. No prognosis was given by the doctors, but only did the best they could. Max and Saga were in critical condition. Even if they had managed to save their lives, it was unlikely that they would have ever been able to even breathe on their own. The condition of their mother was assessed as very serious, but stable. The young woman was put into a medically induced coma and hooked up to life support machines, hoping her body could cope. While doctors were fighting for the lives of the victims, forensic experts were working at the scene, trying to find clues and reconstruct the picture of the crime. Inside the house, chaos reigned. Scattered belongings, blood on the floor and walls. Unfortunately, the medics left behind a lot of clutter, as well as moving certain items around to allow access to the victims. The floor where Emma, Max, and Saga were lying was literally trampled on, and now the medics had to figure out what footprints belonged to them and if the perpetrator's prints were there. Remarkably, the intruder had massacred the three victims, at most in 13 minutes. Since the last message from Emma to her sister was sent at 07:07 p.m., and at 07:20 p.m. already received a call to the police from a frightened Torgny. That said, the brutality with which the perpetrator massacred them spoke of some personal motive and a deep dislike for the victims. The weapon of the crime was a blunt and heavy object, presumably a hammer, which the mysterious criminal used to bludgeon his victims with ferocity. However, nothing of the kind could not be found at the scene, from which the natural conclusion was that the perpetrator took it with him. First suspect. From the start, Hellberg was the prime suspect. He was not married to Emma and was not the father of her children, and therefore it was suggested that perhaps a domestic quarrel between the couple could turn into a bloodbath. The grief-stricken man was immediately questioned, but he had an ironclad alibi. Firstly, he was really late at work, which was confirmed by his boss and colleagues, and secondly, at the time of the brutal massacre of his loved ones, He was walking down the street and was caught on a number of CCTV cameras. Nevertheless, Torney was decided to take a detailed statement, as he might have seen or heard something important that could help in the investigation of the crime. However, he could not remember anything specific, for it was business as usual until he saw the mess and the bodies lying on the floor. The only thing that alerted him was the unlocked front door, which could indicate that Emma had let the criminal in. After questioning, the man was released. By then, he had already informed his fiancée's family, and Emma's parents immediately rushed to Arboga from Stockholm. Together, they went by car straight to the hospital to the victims, but on the way there, they learned from the news on the radio terrible news. Max and Saga died of their injuries without regaining consciousness. Ex-husband's revenge? The new suspect was Emma's ex-husband and father of the children, Nicholas. The couple had been divorced for more than a year and parted peacefully. They did not manage. They constantly quarreled, sued for custody of the children, and the man even threatened the ex-spouse, which she reported to the police. It seemed that everything fits. After the breakup of the young woman took the children and took them to another city to his new chosen one, and their father, not having achieved custody through the court on the grounds of hostility to Emma, decided to take a desperate step and in a fit of rage and crucified the heirs. Nicholas was immediately tracked down and taken into custody, but the man seemed crushed by the news of Max and Saga's deaths, sobbing and constantly asking if there was some mistake. When he was charged with what had happened, he was at first stunned and then began shouting that he would never hurt his children, whom he adored. When asked where Nicholas was at the time of the crime, he replied that he was away in another city, where he went on business for a day. It sounded strange, but soon his alibi was confirmed. The man was indeed 120 miles away from the crime scene when someone was massacring his ex-wife and children. Searching for clues and fearing for the life of the sole survivor, forensic investigators remained active at the scene, trying to find any clues, evidence, or traces of the attacker. But the perpetrator had obviously worn gloves and left no fingerprints. With traces of shoes, everything was much more difficult because the house was visited by a dozen doctors who rendered assistance and took out the victims. Now it was necessary to collect all the footprints there and to find out which of them did not belong to the medics, Torgny or the victims themselves. The law enforcers were afraid that the criminal, having learned that Emma had survived, might sneak into the hospital and finish what he had started. After all, she was a crucial witness, and in case she came to her senses and could testify, she would certainly give him away. Therefore, a 24-hour guard was posted outside Youngstig's room. At the same time, neighbors were interviewed in search of possible witnesses. One woman recalled that at around 05 in the evening, a stranger in black clothes was walking around Emma and Torney's house. She thought it was strange, but she could not see the man's face because it was hidden by a hood. However, the neighbor suggested that it could be a girl because the figure was short and fragile. The same figure in black clothes and with a hood on his head also got into the lens of the street surveillance camera, located on the store a couple of minutes' walk from the scene of the crime. It also appeared to law enforcement that the woman in the video was a short, frail-looking girl. But who was she? And why would she wish harm on Emma and her children? The recording decided to show Torgny and to find out his opinion about who the stranger could be and whether he has any assumptions about it. Already from the first frames, the man began to change in his face, turned pale, and then said that it could be his ex-girlfriend, 31-year-old Christina Schurer, although he could not say for sure. Who is Christina Schurer? Torgny's former sweetheart was born in Hanover, Germany in 1977. When she was still a child, her father left the family and practically stopped communicating with his daughter, which negatively affected her mental state and behavior. The girl grew up willful and purposeful, but had a complex character. As a teenager, she went to the United States on an exchange program and lived in New York for several years. The girl received a good education in the field of history and archaeology, traveled extensively throughout Europe, taking part in excavations and expeditions. In the summer of 2006, she went to Greece, to the island of Crete, where she got a job in one of the popular hotels as a tour guide. There in July came on vacation 26-year-old Torgny, who immediately attracted Christina. He also liked this smart, interesting, and educated girl with whom he had an affair from the first days of acquaintance. Schur at that time was 29 years old, but a small age difference did not embarrass the couple. Their connection lasted for a week while the guy was vacationing in the hotel, and after his departure they continued to communicate by phone and correspond on the internet. A few months later, Christina came to Hellberg in Sweden and literally asked to stay at his house. Even then, such behavior seemed to Torgny too intrusive and even tactless. So when Christina offered him a weekend trip to the mountains, he refused and sincerely hoped that this was the last time they would meet. But the girl continued to call, write, and insist on a new meeting. In January 2007, during a phone conversation, Torgny told Christina that everything was over between them and they should not meet again, but Christina pretended not to hear it. She continued to call, asking to come to visit him, and calling Torgny to go on vacation with her. In the spring of 2007, Christina again came to Sweden and began to literally stalk the former boyfriend. She persuaded him to resume their relationship, although he honestly admitted that he is already dating another. Then Christina said that during the previous visit, forgot in his house something of the things, and she needs to take them away. Torgny agreed, but as soon as they crossed the threshold, the former lover tried to seduce him, and having received a firm refusal, said that he will still regret. 3 months later, Christina returned again and began to apologize for her behavior, again persuading the guy to get together, but he rejected her, and in the evening she called, saying that she swallowed pills because she does not want to live without him. Hellberg called her an ambulance and also called her family, telling them about Christina's antics and advising them to see a psychiatrist. After Schur received the necessary care at the hospital, her mother took her away and placed her in a psychiatric hospital, where she spent more than a month. However, the treatment did not give much results, and the girl remained literally obsessed with her former lover, constantly thinking about how to get him back and inventing new reasons for meetings. In October 2007, Christina decided to move to Sweden and settled in the suburbs of Stockholm, where she rented an apartment with another girl. She started to pursue her ex-boyfriend again, and when she got to meet him, she told him that she had given birth to a son by him, but gave the child to a foster family. Torgny was shocked by this news, but what he was most interested in was when it had happened. The last time they had been intimate was more than a year ago, and after that, they had met 3 more times at different times, but Christine had shown no signs of pregnancy. She herself answered evasively, and each time added some new details. In January 2008, after a dozen unsuccessful attempts to meet with Torgny, Christina wrote him a message in which she told him that their son had been diagnosed with a certain hereditary disease, and now they should go to Germany together to see him. She also added that the child's adoptive father would contact him and give him the details. At this time, she and Emma were in the process of moving to a new home, and the girlfriend was aware of the whole story. She believed that Tony's ex-girlfriend was simply trying to lure him to Germany, and no son had ever existed. When Tony received a call from a man who introduced himself as the adoptive father of her and Christine's child, Tony, on Emma's advice, began to ask questions about when the boy was born, in which hospital it happened, and so on. The interlocutor was clearly annoyed, avoided answering in every possible way, and then, and after all, hung up the phone. So Hellberg finally came to the conclusion that no son never existed. Christine made up the whole story and asked someone from the acquaintances to play along. Christina's arrest and the search for evidence. After learning such a convoluted story, detectives quickly found out where the new suspect lived and went to the address. The door was opened by her roommate, who told them that Christina had hurriedly packed her things the day before and said that she was going back to Germany. A check showed that the girl had indeed left the country, so now the Swedish police had to seek help from their German colleagues to arrest her. On March 20th, a warrant was issued for her arrest. When the suspect was arrested, she claimed that there had been a mistake and that she had nothing to do with the massacre. But after she was taken to Sweden on March 29th, she immediately requested a meeting with Torny, which was denied. She was completely calm, but periodically asked to meet or call her ex again. Christina's rented apartment was thoroughly searched, and her phone and laptop were seized for inspection. All her clothes were thoroughly checked, but no traces of blood were found there. By then, investigators had worked out which of the bloody shoe prints at the scene did not belong to the medics and family members, so it was determined to be athletic. And from the tread pattern, they even figured out the brand and appearance. The size matched the one worn by the suspect, but she herself claimed that she never had such a model of sneakers. However, this statement was quickly refuted, as the shoes were identified by her roommate. Much more interesting findings awaited detectives in Christina's laptop. It was full of photos of Torgny, both their joint, and those where the man was depicted alone or in the company of his new lover. Also, in a separate folder with a very unpleasant signature, contained pictures of Emma and her children, which the suspect copied from the rival's page in the social network. Scherer captioned each photo with insulting, threatening, and downright scary captions. In the recovered search history were found requests on how to commit a murder without leaving traces, how to hide traces of the crime, and how to divert suspicion from himself. Also in the notes, investigators found a plan of Emma and Torny's new home and notes that indicated when the man left for work and what time he returned, and some other notes regarding the family's daily routine. Interview with survivor. Emma's condition was stabilized, her vitals gradually began to improve, and towards the end of March, doctors decided to gradually bring her out of the medically induced coma. Upon awakening, she was still unable to speak because of the breathing tube, but her gaze was meaningful. It was clear that she recognized the relatives present in the room, but did not understand what had happened to her and how she had ended up in the hospital. As soon as the victim became a little stronger and was able to speak clearly, the police agreed to talk to her, but decided not to tell her what had happened to the children. And then it turned out that Emma had no memory of the events of that fateful day, and believed that she must have been in a car accident. She kept asking about the children and whether they were all right. At first, she was given evasive answers, but then her family and medical team decided that there was no point in withholding such information. When Emma was told about what had happened and that her babies were no longer alive, she became hysterical. The doctors had to sedate her, after which she fell asleep, and when she woke up, she did not remember the conversation and asked about the children again. This continued for several weeks, and during this time, the mother was told several times about the death of her daughter and son, but her brain apparently refused to accept this information, each time erasing it. After another month, Emma, accompanied by medics, decided to be brought to the scene. Once inside the house, she suddenly remembered everything. The young woman told how she was texting with her sister, setting the table, and the children were playing near her when there was a knock on the door. She opened the door and saw a dark, short female figure on the threshold, but when she asked what she wanted, she felt a sharp pain and her eyes went black. The figure skulked into the house, and the desperate mother, out of her last strength, tried to catch up with her to protect her children, but apparently fell in the hallway, where they tried to finish her off. The trial and the verdict. Christina continued to stubbornly deny her guilt. The weapon of the crime was never found, and almost all the evidence found was circumstantial, which gave her a high chance of getting away with it. However, Christina's roommate, when questioned, said that in March a hammer was missing from her toolkit. She produced the toolkit itself, and the investigation determined that the size and configuration of that brand of tool matched the murder weapon. But that evidence was also circumstantial. Detectives were able to find surveillance footage from a suburban bus station, where Schurrer had traveled 3 times in the week before the crime. She herself could not explain why she visited Arbuga so often, but apparently the girl came to keep an eye on her future victims. The suspect was also unable to explain why she was searching the internet for information on how to cover up the crime and why she was collecting photos of Emma and her children. On July 29, 2008, the trial over Christina, who was accused of double murder with particular cruelty as well as attempted murder, began. The defendant herself behaved more than strangely. Upon entering the courtroom, she smiled and began to wave her hand, greeting those present. When she was asked questions about the massacre and was shown gruesome footage of the crime scene with mutilated bodies, she suddenly laughed. This suggested that the defendant was insane, but the appointed psychiatric examination established that the girl was sane and perfectly aware of what was happening. Consequently, she enjoyed what she had done and did not even try to hide it. When Emma was in the courtroom and saw Christina there, she fainted. When she was brought to her senses, she said that she finally remembered everything, and this face was the last thing she saw on that fateful day. Despite the defense lawyer's attempts to prove her client's innocence, the jury unanimously found her guilty on all counts. Christina was sentenced to life in prison with no right to ever be released. She was also ordered to pay 20,000 euros in compensation to Emma. No evidence was found that Christina had ever been pregnant and had given birth to a son by Torgny. As for Youngstig, her recovery process was long and arduous, but Torgny did not abandon his beloved. They were married in the summer of 2010. The couple are now raising 2 common heirs who know the sad story of their older brother and sister,